History called her the Poisoner Queen. They meant it as a curse. She wore it like armor. In 1519, in Florence, a girl was born into the most powerful banking family in Europe, and orphaned within weeks. By the time she was 14, she had survived siege, imprisonment, and the threat of execution. By the time she was 40, she ruled the largest kingdom in Europe from behind a throne that was never legally hers. They said she poisoned her enemies with scented gloves. They said she kept a room of mirrors for dark magic. They said she orchestrated a massacre that turned the scene red with the blood of thousands. Some of it was true. Much of it was not. All of it made her the most feared woman in 16th century Europe. For 40 years, while kings died around her, a husband, 3 sons who wore the crown, and countless rivals who thought they could outmaneuver her, Catherine de Medici remained standing. Not because she was loved, because she made certain she could never be safely ignored. Tonight, her story whispers you to sleep. Good evening, sleepy soul. Welcome home to She-Wolf Sleep, your quiet corner for history's most dangerous women, told gently, told slowly, told just for you. New here? Welcome to the pack. Returning? Always a pleasure to have you back. Make yourself comfortable. Lights low. Let the day fall away. Tonight we travel to Renaissance Florence and then to the candlelit corridors of the French court, through plague and civil war, through the deaths of kings and the whispered accusations of poison that followed her to her grave. We will walk beside a girl the world expected to be nothing, and watch her become a woman an entire kingdom feared to cross. This is her complete story, told with all the darkness she earned and the respect she deserved. Before we begin, a like helps other sleepy souls find their way here. Subscribe so you never miss another she-wolf. And tell me in the comments, do you think Catherine de Medici was a monster, or simply a woman who did what she had to do to survive in a world built to destroy her? Blankets close, breath slow. Let's begin. Florence, in the spring of 1519, was a city that believed in beauty and believed in blood in almost equal measure. Its churches held some of the finest paintings the world had ever seen. Its politics held some of the cruelest betrayals. Both were considered, in their way, forms of art. Into this city, on the 13th of April, a child was born to Lorenzo de Medici, Duke of Urbino, and his French wife, Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne. They named her Caterina. History would come to know her as Catherine. She was, from her very first breath, a Medici, heir to the wealth of the most formidable banking dynasty in Europe. A family that had produced popes, that had funded Michelangelo and Botticelli, that had bent the politics of an entire peninsula to its will for nearly a century. To be born a Medici was to be born into power. But power, Catherine would learn before she could even understand the word, was never given freely. It had to be taken. And it was never, ever safe. Her mother died of fever 15 days after giving birth to her. Her father died 6 days after that, likely of syphilis, though the court physicians spoke of it only in careful whispers. Some said Catherine's birth had been cursed from its very first hour, that a girl who cost both her parents their lives could bring nothing but misfortune to whoever loved her next. Perhaps, in the quiet nursery where she was left in the care of relatives who had not asked for her, the infant Catherine already understood something that would define the rest of her life. That she was, in the eyes of the world around her, expendable, a pawn on a chessboard built by men, a vessel for alliances she had no say in, a girl whose only value lay in who she might one day marry, and what that marriage might buy for someone else. She was raised first by her grandmother, Alfonsina Orsini, and then, after Alfonsina's death, by her aunt, Clarice de Medici. Women who understood, better than most, that a Medici child was never simply a child. She was an asset, a future currency of alliance to be spent when the moment was right. By the time Catherine was 7 years old, Florence itself had turned against her family. In 1527, the Medici were expelled from the city in a popular uprising, and the young orphan girl, the last legitimate heir of the main Medici line, became something far more dangerous than an inconvenience. She became a hostage. The Republican government that seized control of Florence understood exactly what they held in their hands. Some of her family's enemies suggested she be displayed naked on the city walls to shame the Medici name before all of Florence. Others suggested worse, that she be handed over to soldiers or killed outright, to erase the bloodline entirely. She was 8 years old when men debated her death in open council chambers, and she was moved from convent to convent for her own protection, a child hidden behind stone walls while the world outside decided whether she deserved to live. She spent time in the convent of Santa Lucia and later at Santissima Annunziata delle Murate, among nuns who, by most accounts, treated her with genuine tenderness, the closest thing to stability she had known. Historians believe these years shaped her more than any that came before or after, a girl learning, in the safety of the cloister, that intelligence and quiet observation could be their own kind of armor. But safety in Florence was never permanent for a Medici. In 1529, Pope Clement VII, himself a Medici, and Catherine's own cousin, allied with the Holy Roman Emperor to besiege the city and reclaim it for the family. For nearly a year, Florence starved behind its walls, while Catherine, now 10 years old, remained trapped inside it, a prisoner and a prize in the very siege being fought in her family's name. When the city finally fell in 1530, voices among the defeated Republicans called once more for her death, or for her to be handed to soldiers as spoils of war. It was only the intervention of cooler political minds, who understood that a dead Medici heiress was worth far less than a living one, that spared her. She was 10 years old, and she had already survived exile, imprisonment, and calls for her own execution. Most children of her era never left the village of their birth. Catherine de Medici had already learned the 2 lessons that would define the rest of her life, that the world would decide her worth long before she was permitted to decide it herself, and that survival was not something granted to the deserving. It was something seized, quietly, by those clever enough to wait for their moment. After the siege ended, Catherine was brought to Rome, where her cousin Pope Clement VII took a direct and careful interest in her upbringing for the first time. It was here, in the splendor of the papal court, that the orphaned refugee of Florence's civil chaos began to be transformed, deliberately and methodically, into something else entirely, a valuable and marriageable asset, groomed for whatever alliance the Pope determined would most benefit the Medici family's interests across Europe. She was given tutors in French, in dancing, in the elaborate manners expected of Renaissance nobility. She was dressed, for the first time in years, in clothing befitting her bloodline rather than the plain habits of convent life. The starving, frightened child of the Florentine siege was, quite deliberately, being polished into a queen, though no one, including Catherine herself, yet knew which throne she might eventually occupy. It is worth pausing here on a detail that later biographers find quietly devastating, even amid this glittering transformation. Contemporary accounts describe Catherine as unusually serious for a girl her age, watchful in a way that unsettled some who met her, as though she had simply never been permitted the luxury of an ordinary childhood, and had stopped expecting one somewhere along the way. She had been auctioned, in effect, by two opposing political forces before she had even reached puberty. First as a hostage whose death was debated in council chambers, then as a bride whose marriage was negotiated like a shipping contract between the papacy and the French crown. Perhaps it should surprise no one that the woman she eventually became understood with such chilling clarity that affection and safety were rarely offered to a woman simply because she deserved them. The negotiations that finally produced Catherine's marriage to Henry of Orleans reveal, in their granular political detail, exactly how thoroughly her fate remained, bound to forces entirely beyond her own control, even as she approached the threshold of adulthood. Pope Clement VII, weighing multiple potential suitors for his valuable young cousin across the courts of Europe, ultimately calculated that a French alliance offered the greatest strategic benefit to papal interests in Italy, where French military support could prove decisive in countering the growing dominance of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V across the Italian peninsula. King Francis I, for his part, saw in the match an opportunity to secure papal goodwill and a substantial dowry at a moment when French royal finances remained strained from years of costly warfare, even as he privately harboured the class-conscious reservations about elevating merchant-class blood so close to his own throne that would continue to colour French noble attitudes toward Catherine for decades to come. The specific terms of the marriage contract, negotiated across many months of careful diplomatic correspondence between Rome and the French court, included not only the substantial financial dowry that made Catherine such an attractive match despite her family's non-royal origins, but also carefully worded provisions regarding papal military and financial support for French ambitions in Italy. Provisions that reveal just how thoroughly the marriage functioned as a calculated instrument of geopolitical strategy rather than any consideration of the personal happiness or well-being of the 14-year-old girl whose future the negotiations ultimately determined. She did not yet have power. But she was already, unmistakably, becoming someone who understood exactly how power worked and exactly what it cost to be without it. Consider for a moment what those years inside the besieged city must have felt like to a child barely old enough to understand the politics being fought over her head. The bells of Florence, once rung for feast days and celebrations, now rang warnings of approaching cannon fire. Food grew scarce within the walls. Disease crept through crowded streets never designed to hold a population under siege. And somewhere within those walls, moved quietly from one convent to another as the danger shifted, a girl of 9 or 10 sat in cold stone rooms and listened to nuns whisper prayers for a city that might, at any moment, decide her life was worth less than the message her death could send. To understand what made Catherine's childhood so uniquely precarious, it helps to understand Florence itself in these years, a city that had spent generations oscillating between Republican government and Medici rule, each transition marked by exile, confiscation, and sometimes bloodshed. The Medici were not simply a wealthy family. They were, to their supporters, the guarantors of Florentine glory, patrons whose money had built the Renaissance itself, and to their enemies, tyrants who had strangled the city's ancient republican liberties beneath the weight of banking fortunes and papal alliances. A child born into this family inherited not just wealth, but the full weight of that unresolved political argument, whether she wanted it or not. Catherine's father, Lorenzo, had himself been groomed for power by his uncle, Pope Leo X, installed as Duke of Urbino through a combination of family influence and military conquest, and had married a French noblewoman in a match designed to bind the Medici fortune to the French crown decades before his daughter's own marriage would attempt the same thing on a grander scale. He was, by most contemporary accounts, an unremarkable ruler, more interested in the trappings of power than its responsible exercise, and his death from what court physicians delicately termed the French disease, syphilis, contracted, historians believe during his own dissolute youth, left his infant daughter not only orphaned but saddled with a faintly scandalous inheritance that Florentine gossips never entirely let her forget. It was into the care of her grandmother Alfonsina Orsini, herself a formidable political operator from one of Rome's most powerful noble families, that infant Catherine was first placed. Alfonsina, historians note, was already elderly and in declining health by the time she assumed responsibility for her orphaned granddaughter, and she died within a year, leaving the girl's upbringing to pass once more, this time to her aunt Clarice de Medici, a woman remembered by contemporaries as pious, strong-willed, and utterly devoted to preserving the Medici name against the political chaos gathering around Florence in the late 1520s. 3 guardians, 3 households, 3 sets of expectations, all before Catherine had reached the age of 5. It is worth sitting with that fact for a moment. How thoroughly instability had already become the defining rhythm of her earliest years, long before Florence itself descended into open revolt. The cultural world into which Catherine was born, whatever the political chaos surrounding her family's position, deserves its own consideration, because it shaped the intellectual and aesthetic sensibilities she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Florence in the 1520s remained, despite its political turmoil, one of the great centres of art, scholarship, and humanist learning in all of Europe. A city whose streets and palaces housed works by Michelangelo, whose libraries contain some of the finest collections of classical and contemporary literature available anywhere on the continent, and whose intellectual culture prized education, rhetoric, and refined taste as essential markers of civilized nobility. Even amid the chaos of her early childhood, Catherine would have been exposed, however indirectly, to this rich cultural inheritance, an exposure that later manifested clearly in her lifelong devotion to art, architecture, and the elaborate court spectacles that would eventually become hallmarks of her own reign in France, transplanting something of Florentine Renaissance sensibility onto French soil in ways that would influence French court culture for generations. It is also worth noting that Catherine, despite the turbulence of her early years, received what historians generally regard as a genuinely excellent education by the standards of Renaissance noblewomen, instruction in Latin, in the classical literature so prized by humanist scholars of the era, in mathematics and the sciences as they were then understood, and in the elaborate social and rhetorical skills that would prove essential to her later political career. This education, absorbed during the relatively stable interludes between the upheavals of her childhood, provided the intellectual foundation upon which her later political acumen would be built, and it distinguished her throughout her life from many of her French noble contemporaries, whose education, particularly among women, rarely reached comparable depth or rigor. This education stands in notable contrast to the more limited instruction typically afforded to French noblewomen of the period, whose formal schooling, when provided at all, tended to emphasize domestic accomplishment, religious devotion, and social grace over the kind of rigorous classical and administrative training Catherine received during her Italian upbringing. Several historians studying the comparative education of Renaissance-era queens and regents have noted that Catherine's Florentine formation, shaped by a family tradition that valued learning as a genuine instrument of dynastic power rather than merely an ornamental social grace, gave her intellectual tools that many of her French-born contemporaries, however well connected by birth, simply never acquired. It is worth considering how much of her later reputation for political cunning may in fact reflect nothing more mysterious than this straightforward advantage in education and training, a woman equipped by careful upbringing rather than any innate or sinister gift, with genuinely superior analytical and administrative capabilities compared to many of the nobles she would eventually outmaneuver. There is a particular anecdote recorded by several contemporary Florentine chroniclers describing young Catherine's fascination with the elaborate clockwork mechanisms and scientific instruments housed in Medici family collections, a fascination that historians have sometimes cited as early evidence of the restless, analytical intelligence that would later distinguish her political career from that of many contemporaries who relied more heavily on inherited status and instinct than on careful, systematic calculation. Whether this particular anecdote reflects genuine childhood memory or the kind of flattering embellishment that biographers of powerful figures often introduce retrospectively, it captures something historians broadly agree upon: that Catherine, from a remarkably young age, displayed an unusual capacity for sustained, careful attention to complex systems and detailed information. A quality that would later manifest in her legendary command of court politics, her extensive correspondence networks, and her genuinely impressive grasp of the administrative minutiae of French governance across 4 decades of political involvement. Historians believe the nuns of Santissima Annunziata delle Murate, in particular, grew genuinely fond of her, this quiet, watchful child who read voraciously, who asked questions far beyond her years, who seemed to absorb the tension around her not by breaking beneath it, but by growing very, very still. The way a creature does when it has learned that stillness is sometimes the only form of safety available. It is worth noting, too, that when Florence finally fell and Catherine was extracted from the convent to be delivered to her Medici relatives, she reportedly wept. Not from fear of what awaited her, but from grief at leaving the sisters who had shown her more genuine warmth than her own bloodline ever had. Perhaps it was here, among women who had chosen quiet lives of contemplation over the violent games played by the men outside their walls, that Catherine first learned to separate power from love, to understand that the two rarely travelled together, and that a person wise enough to survive would learn not to expect them to. The specific horror of the 1527 expulsion deserves its own careful telling, because it shaped everything that followed. When Rome itself was sacked that same year by mutinous imperial troops, an atrocity so shocking it sent tremors through every court in Italy, and effectively paralysed Pope Clement VII's ability to project power for months, the Medici's Florentine enemies seized their opening. A popular uprising drove the family from the city, re-establishing the old Republican government, and 8-year-old Catherine, along with her extended relatives, was forced to flee the Palazzo Medici in the dead of night, leaving behind not just the material comforts of her childhood, but the only stable identity she had ever known. She would not see the inside of that palace again for nearly 3 years, and when she finally did, it would be as the prized hostage of a besieging army led, in an almost unbearable irony, by her own family attempting to reclaim what had been taken from them. The siege itself, when it came in 1529, was among the more brutal episodes of an already brutal century of Italian warfare. Pope Clement VII, having reconciled with the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V after the sack of Rome had demonstrated the cost of opposing him, secured imperial troops to help him retake Florence for the Medici family. For roughly 10 months, the city endured blockade, bombardment, and the slow starvation that siege warfare inevitably brought to civilian populations trapped behind city walls. Bread prices soared. Disease spread through crowded, malnourished neighborhoods. And within those walls, the Republican government that had expelled the Medici family 3 years earlier now held the last surviving legitimate heir of that same family as its most valuable and most vulnerable prisoner. Contemporary chronicles describe increasingly desperate council debates inside besieged Florence over what to do with the young Medici heiress. Some radical voices, believing total destruction of the Medici bloodline was the only way to guarantee the Republic's permanent survival, argued for her execution outright. Others, marginally less extreme, proposed the humiliation of displaying her, stripped and bound, from the city's defensive walls, in the hope that the sight of their own kinswoman in danger might demoralize the besieging Medici forces below. A minority, ultimately the voices that prevailed, argued more coldly and more practically that a living hostage retained bargaining value that a dead or defiled one would immediately lose. It was this narrow, pragmatic calculation, rather than any mercy extended to a frightened child, that Catherine had to thank for her survival. Historians researching the surviving council records have noted how strikingly impersonal the entire debate reads, men discussing the fate of an 8, then 9, then 10-year-old girl with the same detached calculation they might apply to a captured supply cache or a strategic bridge. She was, in the truest and coldest sense, a political asset under discussion, not a child under anyone's particular protection. When the city finally capitulated in August of 1530, starved into submission after months of siege, the terms of surrender were negotiated with unusual bitterness on both sides. Catherine, by then 10 years old, was quietly and quickly moved out of the city and delivered into Medici custody, narrowly escaping the final chaotic days of reprisal and score settling that followed Florence's fall, when supporters of the old Republican government faced imprisonment, exile, and in some cases execution at the hands of the returning Medici regime. It is difficult to overstate how formative this entire sequence of events must have been for a child whose earliest coherent memories were not of nursery games or family warmth, but of starvation, siege warfare, and men in council chambers calmly weighing the political utility of her death. Pope Clement VII, having reclaimed Florence and secured his young cousin's safety, did not intend to let her value go to waste. A Medici girl, orphaned but wealthy, connected to the papacy itself, was one of the most valuable marriage prizes in Europe. The Pope began negotiations that would determine the next 4 decades of Catherine's life, and, in ways no one could have predicted, the future of an entire kingdom. In 1533, at the age of 14, Catherine was married to Henri, Duke of Orleans, the second son of King Francis I of France. It was, on paper, a spectacular match, an Italian heiress bound to French royalty, a union sealed with lavish celebration in Marseille, blessed personally by the Pope, who travelled from Rome himself to preside over the wedding, an almost unheard of honour, underscoring just how significant the alliance was considered on the Italian side of the arrangement. The wedding celebrations lasted for weeks, filled with banquets, masked balls, and tournaments meant to dazzle the French nobility with the wealth the Medici fortune could provide. The wedding celebrations lasted for weeks, filled with banquets, masked balls, and tournaments meant to dazzle the French nobility with the wealth the Medici fortune could provide. The specific pageantry of the Marseille celebrations deserves some description, if only to convey the sheer scale of spectacle that both the papacy and the French crown invested in this alliance. Pope Clement VII arrived by galley with an enormous retinue of cardinals, diplomats, and attendants, a papal visit to French soil so significant that it would not be repeated by any pontiff for centuries afterward. The wedding mass itself was celebrated with a splendour few French royal weddings had ever matched, and the ensuing celebrations included elaborate banquets featuring delicacies imported specifically for the occasion, allegorical performances celebrating the union of Florentine wealth and French royal blood, and gift exchanges of jewels and fine goods calculated to impress observers from across Europe who had travelled to witness the spectacle. King Francis I, ever attentive to the political theatre such occasions demanded, ensured the celebrations projected an image of French royal magnificence and Italian alliance that served his broader diplomatic ambitions in Italy, where he remained locked in ongoing rivalry with the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V for influence over the fractious Italian peninsula. For young Catherine herself, not yet 15 years old, the celebrations must have represented an almost dizzying reversal of fortune. A girl who, only a few years earlier, had been debated as a potential execution victim in besieged Florence, now standing at the center of one of the most lavish royal celebrations Europe had witnessed in a generation. Married into the oldest and most prestigious royal house on the continent. Whatever genuine anxiety she may have carried into this new chapter of her life, the sheer scale of the transformation her circumstances had undergone in so short a span of years offers its own quiet testament to just how thoroughly the currents of dynastic politics could reshape a single life, for better and for worse, often within the span of a few short years. Catherine arrived in France with an enormous dowry and, some accounts suggest, with something almost as valuable to the culturally curious French court, a retinue of Italian cooks, perfumers, and artisans who would, over the following decades, quietly reshape French court culture in ways still felt centuries later. But no amount of spectacle could fully disguise the underlying imbalance at the heart of the match, one that French nobles were quick to whisper about behind painted fans and velvet sleeves. France, in the 1530s, remained a kingdom deeply proud of its ancient royal bloodlines and deeply suspicious of what many nobles viewed as new. Mercantile money attempting to buy its way into old aristocratic legitimacy. The Medici, for all their wealth and papal connections, had risen to prominence through banking rather than through the sword or ancient inherited titles that French nobility prized above nearly everything else. Courtiers spoke of Catherine, both to her face in careful coded compliments and behind her back in far less careful terms, as the Italian shopkeeper's daughter. A phrase that captured precisely the contempt with which the oldest French families regarded her, regardless of the fortune she brought with her, regardless of the Holy Father's personal blessing on her marriage. Even King Francis I, who had personally engineered the match for its financial and diplomatic benefits, reportedly harbored private reservations about elevating what he considered common blood so close to his own throne. Reservations he set aside only because the alliance suited France's broader strategic interests in Italy at the time. Catherine arrived at the French court a foreigner in nearly every sense that mattered to the people around her, foreign in language, though she quickly proved herself an able student, foreign in custom, foreign in the particular unspoken codes of French aristocratic behavior that took years, not months, to fully absorb. She spoke French with an accent that some courtiers mocked openly in her early years, and she found herself again and again navigating a court whose rules had been written by and for people who had never intended to make room for her. It is against this backdrop that her husband's devotion to Diane de Poitiers must be understood, not simply as personal romantic rejection, painful as that undoubtedly was, but as a public, ongoing referendum on Catherine's very right to belong at the French court at all. Diane was French nobility through and through, elegant, accomplished, fluent in every unspoken rule of the court that still eluded the young Italian bride. Henry's devotion to her was not merely a private matter of the heart. It was, in the eyes of the watching court, a continual reminder that the king himself seemed to prefer, in every meaningful sense, a woman who represented everything Catherine was not. Beneath the celebration, the truth was colder. Henry was not expected to become king. His older brother, the Dauphin Francis, stood between him and the throne. Catherine had not married into the center of French power. She had married into its second tier, a useful but ultimately replaceable alliance, an Italian merchant's granddaughter dressed in royal silk but never quite trusted by the French nobility, who considered her beneath them, whatever her fortune. And Henry, her new husband, made his feelings plain from the very beginning. he did not love her. He barely tolerated her. His heart, and very publicly his bed, belonged to another woman entirely, Diane de Poitiers, nearly 20 years his senior, elegant, politically shrewd, and utterly unwilling to relinquish her hold on him even after his marriage. For a young bride arriving in a foreign court, unable to speak the language fluently, mocked behind closed doors for her merchant blood, and openly humiliated by her husband's devotion to another woman, most historians agree this could have broken her entirely. Instead, something else began to take shape. Perhaps in those early years, alone in a bedchamber her husband rarely visited, Catherine began to understand a truth that would define her, that in the French court, sentiment was a luxury she could not afford, and that the surest way to survive contempt was to become indispensable rather than beloved. She could not compete with Diane de Poitiers for Henri's affection, so she did not try. Instead, she turned her attention to something the glamorous mistress could never offer him: an heir. For the first decade of her marriage, that too eluded her. Year after year, Catherine failed to conceive, and the whispers in the French court grew sharper. A queen, or in her case, a duchess, who could not produce children was a queen who could be discarded. Rumours circulated that Henri might seek an annulment, that Catherine's foreign blood and barren womb made her expendable after all, exactly as Florence had once tried to make her. It was in this crucible of quiet desperation, historians believe, that Catherine began cultivating the reputation that would follow her for the rest of her life. She consulted physicians. She consulted astrologers. She turned, some accounts claim, to remedies and rituals from her native Italy that struck the French court as strange, even sinister. The first threads of the dark mythology that would eventually surround her like a shadow she could never quite outrun. The 10 childless years leading up to that first birth deserve to be understood in their full, grinding weight. Contemporary accounts describe Catherine undergoing increasingly desperate treatments recommended by physicians of the era, special diets, unusual tonics even, according to some historians, a procedure involving drinking the urine of pregnant animals, a remedy that reflected less any genuine medical understanding than the sheer desperation of a court determined to solve what it saw as a political emergency dressed up as a fertility problem. Catherine herself is said to have quietly consulted alternative healers and mystics during this period, seeking any possible remedy, a habit that would later be twisted by her enemies into evidence of witchcraft and dark dealings, when in truth it reflected the ordinary, aching desperation of a young woman fighting to secure her own survival in a marriage that offered her position only on the condition that she produce heirs. Then, in 1544, after 10 years of marriage and mounting humiliation, she gave birth to a son, Francis, then another, Elizabeth, and another, and another. Between 1544 and 1556, Catherine bore 10 children in rapid succession, an extraordinary physical toll for any woman of the era, several of whom would go on to wear the crown of France, and several others who would not survive long enough to reach adulthood at all, a pattern of loss that would follow her throughout her life, and one that court gossip, ever eager to find something sinister in Catherine's misfortunes, would later attribute to curses and dark family inheritance rather than the ordinary, brutal mathematics of infant mortality in 16th century Europe. The birth of her first son, Francis, in January 1544, transformed Catherine's position at court almost overnight, and it is worth pausing on the scale of that transformation, because it illustrates just how thoroughly a royal wife's value in this era was measured against the single, narrow criterion of fertility. Where courtiers had spent a decade whispering about annulment and replacement, the same voices now praised Catherine's fecundity with the same energy they had once reserved for her humiliation. A reversal so complete that it offers its own quiet lesson in the transactional nature of the acceptance she had spent a decade seeking. She would go on to bear 9 more children across the following 12 years: Elizabeth, Claude, Louis, Charles, Henry, Margaret, Francis, and twin daughters Victoire and Jeanne. The latter pair dying shortly after a difficult birth that nearly claimed Catherine's own life as well. A labour so dangerous that court physicians reportedly debated whether to save mother or children should a choice become necessary. Catherine survived, though contemporary accounts suggest the ordeal left her physically weakened for a considerable period afterward. One more instance of the immense, largely uncelebrated physical toll that securing her position at court had exacted upon her body across more than a decade of near-continuous childbearing. The first bite had been taken, not a poisoned blade in the dark, but something far quieter and far more devastating to those who had underestimated her. Patience rewarded, position secured, and a woman once dismissed as barren and beneath the throne now bound to it by blood that could never be erased. But even motherhood did not grant her real power. Diane de Poitiers remained at Henry's side, wielding more influence over the kingdom's affairs than the wife who bore its heirs. It was Diane, not Catherine, who often accompanied Henry to council meetings. It was Diane's initials, intertwined with Henry's own, that were carved into the stonework of royal palaces, a public symbol of devotion that Catherine was forced to walk past daily in her own home. It was Diane who helped select the tutors and shape the early upbringing of the very children Catherine had fought so long and so painfully to bear. Beyond the symbolic humiliations of intertwined initials and mistress-appointed tutors, Diane's influence extended into matters of genuine state consequence throughout Henry's reign. Foreign ambassadors seeking royal favour understood that a gift or courtesy extended to Diane often accomplished more than direct petition to the king himself, and she is documented in surviving correspondence as having weighed in on matters ranging from military appointments to the negotiation of her own stepdaughter's marriage terms. Wielding an informal but remarkably comprehensive influence over the machinery of French governance that few officially appointed ministers of the era could match. For Catherine, watching this arrangement persist year after year, the lesson embedded within it must have been impossible to ignore. That formal title, however prestigious, meant little without the accumulated trust, information, and personal relationships required to actually wield the authority that title implied. Precisely the currency Catherine would spend the following decade patiently, invisibly accumulating for herself. Picture, if you can, the particular cruelty of that arrangement, a young mother, still grieving each miscarriage and each year of failed conception that came before her children finally arrived. Watching another woman guide the raising of those same children, watching her husband ride off to hunt and to govern beside a mistress 20 years his senior, while she remained, technically honoured, practically invisible. Some historians believe this humiliation, sustained for over 2 decades, was the true forge in which Catherine's political mind was tempered. Not natural cruelty, but a slow, patient education in exactly how little sentiment mattered in a world built entirely around the interests of powerful men. She did not rage. She did not retreat into bitterness where others could see it. The particulars of Diane de Poitiers' hold over Henry are worth dwelling on, if only to fully appreciate what Catherine endured for over 2 decades in near silence. Diane had first entered Henry's life when he was a grieving, traumatized boy of only 7, held hostage in Spain for 4 years alongside his older brother, as surety for their father's ransom following a disastrous military defeat. A childhood ordeal historians believe left lasting psychological scars on the young prince, scars that Diane upon his return to France, seemed uniquely equipped to soothe. Whatever the precise origins of their bond, by the time Henry married Catherine, his devotion to Diane was already well established and showed no sign of diminishing simply because he had acquired a wife. Diane de Poitiers herself deserves a fuller portrait than the simple role of romantic rival often affords her in popular retellings of Catherine's story, because she was, in her own right, one of the most politically astute women of the 16th century French court. Born into minor nobility and widowed young, she had cultivated, across decades at court, a reputation for elegance, intelligence, and remarkable physical vitality that contemporaries marvelled at well into her 50s, when she remained, by nearly universal account, a woman of striking beauty and commanding presence. She managed royal finances with genuine competence during Henry's reign, oversaw significant architectural projects including her beloved Chenonceau, and exercised influence over royal appointments and policy that, while never formally recognized through any official title, rivaled or exceeded that of many of the kingdom's most powerful ministers. It is this genuine political substance, as much as her romantic hold over the king, that made her such a formidable and enduring rival for Catherine to navigate across more than 2 decades of marriage. Not merely a beautiful distraction, but a woman who had built her own independent power base within the very court structure Catherine would eventually need to master and control. The wedding night itself, according to accounts recorded by contemporary chroniclers and later relayed with evident relish by generations of biographers eager for salacious detail, was reportedly attended in its immediate aftermath by King Francis I himself, who came personally to inspect the young couple's chamber the following morning. A startling breach of privacy by modern standards, but one entirely in keeping with the era's treatment of royal marriages as matters of state requiring visible, verifiable consummation before political alliances could be considered fully secured. Francis I reportedly pronounced himself satisfied with what he found and praised both young spouses for what he characterized as a vigorous demonstration of marital duty, though whatever genuine warmth may have existed between 14-year-old Catherine and 14-year-old Henry in these earliest days of their marriage would prove, in the years that followed, remarkably short-lived once Diane de Poitiers reasserted her hold over the young duke's affections. Diane, for her part, proved remarkably shrewd in managing the delicate triangle. She did not attempt to have Catherine set aside or removed from court, understanding, with the same cold political calculation Catherine herself would later become famous for, that an openly discarded wife created scandal and instability that served no one's interests, least of all her own. Instead, Diane cultivated a strange, uneasy working relationship with the wife, whose husband she controlled even, according to several court chroniclers, personally encouraging Henry to visit Catherine's bed during the difficult years of childlessness, recognizing that an heir born to the crown mattered more to the stability of her own position than any jealousy she might have felt. It was, by any measure, a humiliating arrangement for Catherine to endure, her own husband's mistress essentially managing the terms and frequency of the couple's intimacy, a final indignity layered atop years of public rejection. It is worth noting that Catherine's response to this humiliating arrangement reveals something important about the emotional discipline she was cultivating throughout these difficult years. Rather than expressing open resentment toward Diane, a strategy that would have accomplished nothing beyond alienating a woman who held genuine influence over the king's daily life, Catherine, by most contemporary accounts, maintained a scrupulously correct and even outwardly cordial relationship with her husband's mistress, exchanging pleasantries at court functions, participating in the elaborate social rituals that required the two women to appear together with some regularity, and never, so far as the surviving record indicates, allowing her private anguish to manifest as the kind of public scandal or confrontation that might have damaged her own position further. Historians have long marveled at the sheer emotional control this required. A young foreign bride, humiliated in nearly every conceivable way by her husband's devotion to another woman, nonetheless maintaining the appearance of gracious acceptance for over 2 decades, biding her time with a patience that would only fully reveal its purpose once circumstance finally handed her the opportunity to act. Instead, by most accounts, she cultivated something far more useful: relationships. She made herself agreeable to visiting dignitaries. She hosted magnificent entertainments, elaborate court festivals and ballets that would later become famous throughout Europe for their spectacle, winning quiet admiration even as she was denied any real authority. She read constantly: history, philosophy, the astrological texts that fascinated the Renaissance mind, and above all, the writings of statecraft that would, decades later, inform every calculated decision of her regency. Perhaps in the candlelit hours after the court had gone to sleep and her husband had gone to another woman's chamber, Catherine understood that patience itself could become a weapon, that a woman who appeared to accept her powerlessness would always be underestimated by men too arrogant to imagine she was simply waiting. Catherine watched, learned, and waited, building, in silence, a mind for politics that the French court had never bothered to notice, because no one had thought to look. There is one particularly telling episode from these years that historians often cite as an early glimpse of the political mind that would later govern France. In 1552, King Francis I's successor and Catherine's father-in-law having died some years prior, Henri II, by then king, departed on a military campaign into the 3 bishoprics along France's eastern frontier, leaving Catherine, remarkably, as regent in his absence, a temporary appointment that surprised many at court, who had assumed Diane de Poitiers, or one of the great noble councillors, would be given the honour instead. Catherine handled the brief regency with a competence that seemed to genuinely surprise Henry upon his return, managing correspondence, overseeing administrative matters, and demonstrating a grasp of governance that had gone almost entirely unnoticed during her years of public humiliation. It was a small taste of authority, granted almost as an afterthought, and it would be nearly a decade before circumstance handed her anything resembling it again, but historians believe it planted something important: proof, even if only to herself, that she possessed the capacity to govern, whenever the opportunity finally arrived. It is worth noting, too, the particular loneliness of Catherine's position during these decades. A woman surrounded constantly by courtiers, servants, and eventually her own growing brood of children, and yet fundamentally isolated within a court that had never fully accepted her as anything more than a useful foreign transaction. She maintained correspondence with family back in Italy, though contact grew more difficult and less frequent as the political situation in Florence shifted repeatedly under new Medici dukes she barely knew. She formed a small circle of genuinely trusted companions among her Italian household staff, relationships that would prove durable and important later in her life. But she seems, by the account of most historians who have studied her private letters from this period, to have understood quite clearly that she could rely on almost no one at the French court itself, that whatever safety she eventually built for herself would have to be constructed entirely through her own careful effort, with no inherited alliance or genuine friendship to soften the isolation. For 25 years, Catherine de Medici lived in a court that treated her as an afterthought. She watched her husband's mistress manage royal finances, influence appointments, and even control the upbringing of Catherine's own children. She watched the great noble houses of France, the Guises, the Bourbons, the Montmorencys, circle each other and the throne with open ambition, each certain that the quiet Italian duchess posed no threat to any of them. It was, historians now believe, exactly the position Catherine needed, Underestimation, she had learned since childhood, was not a weakness to overcome. It was a weapon to wield. While the great houses of France postured and warred with each other for influence, Catherine studied. She learned the temperament of every major noble family. She learned which alliances were built on genuine loyalty and which were built on convenience, ready to shatter under pressure. She learned the architecture of power in a kingdom that had never intended to give her any. In 1547, Henry became king following the death of his father, Francis I. Catherine was now Queen of France, a title that, in practice, changed almost nothing. Diane de Poitiers remained the true power behind Henry's affections and much of his governance. Catherine was permitted ceremonial presence, motherhood, and little else. Henry's coronation itself offered a particularly stinging illustration of exactly how little had changed. Diane de Poitiers, though holding no official royal title whatsoever, was granted a place of extraordinary prominence in the ceremonies and celebrations that followed. Her personal emblem, a crescent moon, cleverly entwined with Henry's own royal symbols, displayed prominently throughout the festivities and in the years that followed. Carved permanently into the stonework of royal residences across France, including at the magnificent Château de Chenonceau, which Henry granted to his mistress outright, a gift of a royal property that legally and by tradition should have belonged to the Queen. Catherine, meanwhile, was permitted the ceremonial trappings of her title. She was crowned, she processed. She was formally addressed as Queen, while the substance of royal influence continued flowing almost entirely toward the woman who held her husband's heart. For 12 years, from Henry's coronation until his sudden death, Catherine occupied this peculiar position, queen in name and ceremony, mother of the royal children, and yet almost entirely excluded from the actual machinery of governance. She was present at court, present at councils on occasion, present for the endless round of diplomatic entertainments a queen was expected to host, but decisions of real consequence, appointments of real power, the shaping of policy that would determine the kingdom's direction, moved through channels that rarely, if ever, included her meaningful input. Contemporary Venetian ambassadors, whose detailed dispatches home remain among historians' richest sources for understanding the inner workings of the French court during this period, described Catherine in these years with a kind of bemused pity, a queen of evident intelligence and careful observation, kept nonetheless at the margins of the very government she nominally headed. It is precisely this extended humiliation, historians increasingly argue, that explains the startling speed and decisiveness with which Catherine moved the moment Henry's death finally handed her genuine opportunity. 12 years of watching, of cataloguing which nobles could be trusted and which could not, of learning the temperament and ambition of every major figure at court, had not been wasted time. It had been, in retrospect, the most thorough political education any ruler of the era could have received, an education paid for entirely in humiliation, and one that Catherine, when the moment finally arrived, proved she had absorbed completely. Then, in June of 1559, everything changed in a single afternoon. King Henri II, celebrating the marriages of his daughter and sister with a tournament outside Paris, took part in a jousting match against a captain of his own Scottish Guard, Gabriel de Montgomery. It was meant to be a friendly, ceremonial contest, one final tilt at the end of days of celebration. Contemporary accounts describe Catherine as uneasy about the match beforehand, reportedly begging her husband not to participate further after an earlier round had already gone poorly, troubled, some accounts claim, by dreams or premonitions she could not fully articulate. Henry, ever proud and eager to please the crowd, insisted on one more pass. The lance shattered on impact, as tournament lances were sometimes designed to do. But a splintered fragment drove upward through the narrow gap in his visor and into his eye, penetrating toward his brain. He fell from his horse in front of the entire assembled court, including his wife and his mistress both watching from the stands, an image so laden with symbolic cruelty that later historians and dramatists could scarcely resist returning to it. For 10 agonizing days, the king lingered in the Hôtel des Tournelles, drifting in and out of consciousness, while physicians, including, some accounts claim, the famed astrologer and physician Nostradamus, who had chillingly predicted such a death years before in a quatrain describing a young lion overcoming an old one in single combat, piercing his eyes in a cage of gold, could do nothing to save him. Catherine, by every account, remained at his bedside for the duration of his suffering, an act of devotion striking for a marriage so publicly defined by neglect and humiliation. Perhaps in those final 10 days, watching the man who had spent 25 years loving another woman slowly dying in front of her, Catherine felt something more complicated than simple grief, relief perhaps, mixed with genuine sorrow, and beneath both, the first cold stirrings of an entirely new calculation: what came next, and who would be left to decide it. The immediate practical challenges facing Catherine in the days following Henry's death extended well beyond the emotional weight of grief and political calculation alike. French court protocol regarding royal succession, mourning ceremony, and the formal transfer of authority to a 15-year-old king required careful, immediate management, and Catherine, whatever her personal state of mind, moved through these formal obligations with a composure that contemporary observers found genuinely striking. The elaborate state funeral accorded to Henri II, following weeks of official mourning, during which the entire court adopted the black garments that would become Catherine's own permanent uniform for the remainder of her life, provided the first major test of her ability to manage the machinery of monarchy during a moment of genuine dynastic vulnerability. A test she passed with a level of competence that surprised courtiers, who had spent decades assuming her interest in governance extended no further than the raising of her children. It was during this same delicate transitional period that Catherine first began deploying, with real deliberateness, the extensive network of correspondence and personal relationships she had cultivated during her years of apparent court irrelevance. Letters from this period, preserved in French archives, reveal a queen mother reaching out systematically to regional governors, foreign ambassadors, and noble houses across the kingdom, establishing lines of communication and reassurance that would prove essential to maintaining stability during the uncertain months of her son's minority. It is a testament to just how thoroughly she had studied the machinery of French governance during her decades of watching from the margins that she was able to activate this network so swiftly and so effectively, transforming what might easily have become a period of dangerous instability into a relatively orderly, if still fragile, transfer of authority into her own capable hands. Henri II died on the 10th of July 1559, and in that single devastating moment, the woman the French court had spent 25 years dismissing became something no one had prepared for. The mother of the new king, and the most powerful woman in France. One of Catherine's very first acts as a widow revealed exactly how much she had learned in her years of quiet observation. Before Henry's body had even completed the elaborate funeral rites expected of a French king, Catherine moved against her longtime rival with a speed that stunned observers who had spent decades assuming her incapable of decisive action. She banished Diane de Poitiers from court, stripped her of the crown jewels Henry had given her, and demanded the immediate return of the magnificent Château de Chenonceau, the very castle Diane had used for years as a symbol of her influence over the king, and which Catherine had coveted, by several accounts, for the entirety of her marriage. In exchange, Catherine offered Diane the considerably less prestigious Château de Chaumont, a calculated substitution that allowed Catherine to claim a degree of magnanimity. She had not, after all, left her husband's mistress entirely without property, while ensuring the more valuable, more symbolically significant estate passed permanently out of her rival's hands. It was not simply revenge, though certainly it contained elements of 2.5 decades of accumulated grievance finally given outlet. It was, more precisely, a message, delivered with surgical precision, to every noble house watching. The woman they had ignored for 25 years was done being ignored. Diane, for her part, retired from court entirely, living out the remainder of her years at Chaumont and then Annette in a kind of graceful, wealthy exile, dying in 1566 still in possession of considerable fortune, but stripped forever of the influence over the kingdom's affairs she had once wielded so completely. Catherine, contemporary accounts suggest, never spoke of her former rival with anything resembling warmth, though she was careful, in the delicate calculus of court politics, never to pursue the kind of total ruin that might have made her appear vindictive rather than simply, coldly just. The swiftness of this action sent ripples through every noble house in France. Men who had spent decades treating the Queen as a decorative afterthought suddenly found themselves recalculating, rapidly, exactly how much they had misjudged her. It was a lesson many of them would need to relearn several more times over the following decades, as Catherine continued to demonstrate again and again precisely how dangerous it could be to underestimate a woman simply because she had spent years appearing to accept her own irrelevance. Her eldest son, Francis II, ascended the throne at 15 years old, sickly and inexperienced, easily influenced by the powerful Guise family, into which he had married. For the brief 18 months of his reign, Catherine watched the Guises consolidate power around her son, and she understood, with the same cold clarity that had guided her since childhood in Florence, that she would need to act quickly if she was to secure any real authority for herself. The brief reign of Francis II deserves closer attention than it usually receives, if only because it illustrates so clearly the precariousness of Catherine's position in these first months after Henry's death. Francis, 15 years old and in fragile health for most of his life, historians believe he suffered from a chronic ear infection and possibly an underlying condition that left him perpetually weak, had married Mary, Queen of Scots, the previous year, a union that placed enormous influence in the hands of Mary's powerful Guise uncles, the Duke of Guise and the Cardinal of Lorraine, who moved swiftly to dominate the young king's government the moment Henri II died. For the 18 months of Francis's reign, Catherine found herself once again marginalized, this time not by a rival mistress, but by an entire ambitious family determined to rule France through their niece's teenage husband, treating the Queen Mother as an inconvenience to be managed, rather than a genuine power to be reckoned with. This period tested Catherine's political instincts in ways her earlier decades of court observation had only partially prepared her for. She was forced to watch the Guise family consolidate control over royal appointments, over the young king's council, even over access to Francis himself, while she maneuvered carefully at the margins, building quiet alliances with rival noble houses, particularly the Bourbon family, led by Antoine de Bourbon and his brother, the Prince of Conde, who resented Guise dominance nearly as much as Catherine did, though for very different reasons rooted in their own dynastic ambitions and, increasingly, their sympathy toward the growing Protestant movement. When Francis II died suddenly in December 1560, likely from an ear infection that spread to his brain, though rumours of poison inevitably followed Catherine, as they would follow nearly every royal death for the rest of her life, the throne passed to her second son, Charles IX, a boy of only 10 years old. This time, Catherine did not wait to be overlooked. she moved immediately and decisively to have herself declared governor of France, effectively regent for her young son. The Estates General, the great assembly of the French nobility, confirmed her position. The woman once dismissed as a barren Italian merchant's granddaughter now held legal authority over the entire Kingdom of France. She had not seized the throne through violence. She had not needed to. She had simply outlasted every man who had ever underestimated her, and positioned herself with patient and deliberate precision, exactly where power would eventually have nowhere else to go but into her hands. The formal instrument that secured her regency deserves particular attention, because it reveals just how carefully Catherine had studied the machinery of French governance during her years of apparent powerlessness. French law contained no clear, settled precedent for a queen mother assuming full regency powers over a minor king. Earlier regencies in French history had been contested. Messy affairs, often resolved through the outright political dominance of whichever noble faction proved strongest rather than through any clean legal process. Catherine, working with sympathetic legal advisors and capitalizing on the temporary balance of power between the rival Guise and Bourbon factions, neither of which trusted the other enough to accept sole guardianship of the young king, maneuvered the Estates General into confirming her as governor of France with remarkably broad authority, not merely a ceremonial regent, but the genuine head of government in her son's name. It was, in its way, a masterstroke of political timing. The complex web of noble alliances Catherine navigated in these early months of her regency deserves closer examination, because it illustrates the genuine sophistication of the political landscape she had to master almost overnight. Beyond the two dominant Guise and Bourbon factions, Catherine also had to manage relationships with powerful regional governors, the Constable Anne de Montmorency, an aging but still formidable military and political figure whose family rivaled the Guise in influence and whose loyalty, while nominally Catholic, could not be entirely taken for granted given his complicated personal and political relationships with figures across the religious divide. She cultivated relationships too with foreign powers whose interests inevitably intersected with French domestic religious politics, maintaining careful, often delicate correspondence with Queen Elizabeth I of England, whose own Protestant government watched French religious policy with close interest, and with the Spanish crown, whose Catholic zeal Philip II never hesitated to invoke when he believed French toleration policies had grown dangerously permissive. Managing this constellation of competing interests required precisely the kind of patient, careful political calculation Catherine had spent over 2 decades quietly developing during her years of apparent court irrelevance. She understood, in ways many of her more impulsive noble rivals did not, that lasting political stability required constant maintenance rather than single decisive victories, that alliances needed to be renewed, suspicions needed to be soothed, and that the appearance of even-handedness, however difficult to maintain amid genuinely irreconcilable religious differences, remained essential to preventing any single faction from concluding that outright rebellion offered better prospects than continued negotiation with the crown. Had either the Guise or Bourbon faction possessed clear dominance in the weeks following Francis II's death, it seems unlikely either would have willingly ceded such authority to the Queen Mother. But their mutual suspicion of each other created exactly the kind of political vacuum a shrewd third party could fill, and Catherine, watching and waiting through years of apparent irrelevance, proved more than ready to fill it. Contemporary chroniclers describe the swiftness of her consolidation with a kind of startled admiration, noting how thoroughly she had positioned trusted allies in key administrative posts within mere weeks of securing her authority, as though she had spent years quietly drafting the very plan she now executed with such precision. She moved immediately, too, to address the religious tensions already simmering dangerously beneath the surface of French society, tensions that would come to define nearly the entirety of her regency and the decades that followed. Before turning to the Edict of January itself, it is worth noting Catherine's earlier attempt, in the autumn of 1561, to resolve the kingdom's religious divisions through direct theological dialogue rather than mere legal compromise, the Colloquy of Poissy, an extraordinary gathering she personally convened, bringing together leading Catholic bishops and cardinals alongside prominent Calvinist theologians, including Theodore Beza, John Calvin's own designated successor in Geneva, in an attempt to find some common theological ground that might underpin a lasting religious peace. The colloquy, held in a converted refectory near Paris and attended by Catherine herself with evident personal investment in its outcome, ultimately failed to produce theological reconciliation. The doctrinal gulf separating Catholic and Calvinist positions on matters such as the nature of the Eucharist proved, in the end, too wide for even the most skilled diplomatic bridging to close. But the very fact that Catherine attempted such a dialogue at all reveals something distinctive about her approach to governance. A genuine, if ultimately naive, belief that reasoned conversation between sincere believers might accomplish what force and legal decree alone could not. An optimism that the subsequent decades of bloodshed would test severely, and that the massacre of 1572 would seem, to many observers both then and since, to have shattered entirely. In January of 1562, only months into her formal authority, Catherine issued the Edict of Saint-Germain, sometimes called the Edict of January, granting French Protestants, the Huguenots, a limited but genuinely unprecedented degree of legal toleration to worship outside city walls and hold private assemblies. It was a bold, controversial move for a Catholic regent to make, and it revealed something important about how Catherine intended to govern, not from ideological conviction about religious truth, but from a hard-nosed calculation that a kingdom cannot survive when its rulers insist on annihilating a substantial portion of its own population over matters of private conscience. The theological and philosophical currents shaping this debate deserve some attention, because they help explain why Catherine's pragmatic approach struck contemporaries on both extremes as so genuinely radical, even scandalous. Catholic hardliners of the era, drawing on centuries of established doctrine regarding the sacred unity of faith and political authority, viewed the very notion of tolerating heresy within a Christian kingdom as a direct betrayal of a ruler's most fundamental religious obligation. Not merely poor policy, but genuine spiritual danger threatening divine punishment upon the entire realm should heretical belief be allowed to flourish unchecked. This was not, to such observers, an abstract theological position, but a matter of the gravest practical consequence, a conviction reinforced by generations of preaching that linked national calamity, plague, famine, military defeat, directly to divine displeasure at insufficient religious zeal among a kingdom's rulers. Huguenot theologians, for their part, developed increasingly sophisticated arguments of their own regarding the legitimate boundaries of royal authority, drawing on classical and biblical precedent to argue that a monarch who violated fundamental principles of justice, including religious persecution of sincere believers, forfeited some measure of the absolute obedience traditionally owed to divinely ordained kingship. These arguments, refined considerably in the aftermath of the 1572 massacre by Huguenot political theorists writing in exile, would eventually influence broader European traditions of political thought regarding the legitimate limits of state power, representing, however unintentionally, one of the more significant intellectual legacies of the very religious conflict Catherine spent decades trying to suppress and manage. Caught between these two increasingly sophisticated and mutually incompatible theological political frameworks, Catherine's own approach, essentially bracketing theological truth claims in favor of pragmatic civil peace, represented neither faction's preferred outcome and drew genuine intellectual contempt from serious thinkers on both sides who viewed her apparent indifference to ultimate religious truth as itself a kind of moral failure, whatever practical benefits it might occasionally produce. It is this genuine, principled opposition from committed believers on both sides, as much as any particular political miscalculation on Catherine's part, that explains why her decades-long project of religious accommodation proved so difficult to sustain, requiring constant renegotiation against opponents who, at the deepest level, considered compromise itself a form of betrayal rather than a legitimate political outcome to be respected. The edict satisfied almost no one entirely, which was, in its way, exactly the kind of outcome Catherine's pragmatic instincts tended to produce. Catholic hardliners, led increasingly by the Guise family, viewed any toleration of heresy as a betrayal of the crown's sacred duty to defend the true faith. Huguenot leaders, while grateful for the concession, recognized immediately how limited and conditional the toleration truly was, granted at the pleasure of a crown that could, and eventually would, revoke it the moment political circumstances shifted. But for a brief window in early 1562, it represented the closest France would come to a negotiated religious peace for decades. A testament to what Catherine's patient, transactional approach to governance could achieve, even as it foreshadowed exactly how fragile any peace built on such foundations would ultimately prove to be. Beyond the immediate religious crisis, Catherine's early regency also required her to address the considerable financial exhaustion the crown had inherited from decades of costly warfare against the Habsburgs during her father-in-law and husband's reigns. The treasury Catherine inherited upon assuming her regency was, by most contemporary accounts, in genuinely dire condition. Burdened by debts accumulated across years of Italian campaigns and border conflicts that had drained royal resources even before the additional strain of domestic religious warfare began compounding the crisis further. Catherine worked, throughout these early years, alongside capable financial administrators to renegotiate crown debts, adjust taxation policies, and manage the delicate balance between funding necessary military expenditures and avoiding the kind of crushing fiscal burden that might further inflame popular unrest already simmering across a kingdom exhausted by years of conflict. It was unglamorous, technical work, far removed from the dramatic court intrigue for which Catherine would eventually become most remembered. But historians studying the administrative record of her early regency have come away consistently impressed by the genuine competence she brought to these less visible aspects of governance. Competence that, once again, had been quietly developing throughout her decades of apparent marginalization at court, waiting only for the opportunity to be exercised on a scale commensurate with the ability she possessed. There is a particular image historians return to again and again when describing Catherine in these early months of her regency, a woman in her 40s, dressed permanently in the black mourning clothes she would wear for the remainder of her life, earning her, in later years, the quiet nickname, the Black Queen. Moving through the halls of the Louvre, with a composure that unsettled even seasoned courtiers who had known her for decades as pleasant, unremarkable, easy to overlook. The mourning itself was genuine. By all accounts, whatever the coldness of their marriage, she had loved Henry, or loved at least the position and stability he represented, and his death devastated her. But grief for Catherine was never permitted to become paralysis. Within weeks of burying her husband, she was already reorganizing the machinery of government around her authority, filling key positions with men she trusted, and quietly, deliberately, teaching the great noble houses of France a lesson they had never expected to need learning, that the quiet Italian widow they had spent 25 years dismissing intended to govern and intended to be obeyed. One of the clearest illustrations of her new authority came in the handling of her second son's minority. French law held that a king who had not yet reached the age of majority required a regent. But the precise boundaries of that regent's power were never entirely settled, and ambitious nobles, chief among them the Guise family, who had already tasted real influence during the brief reign of Francis II, believed they might still claim guardianship of the young Charles IX for themselves. Catherine moved decisively to prevent it, securing formal recognition from the Estates General as Governor of France, a title that gave her legal standing few could easily challenge, and one she wielded with a precision that startled nobles who had spent decades assuming her irrelevant. She surrounded herself, in these years, with a group of trusted Italian advisors and astrologers, men who had followed her from Florence or joined her service later, bound to her by loyalty rather than by the tangled, centuries-old rivalries of French noble bloodlines. This reliance on foreign counsel, understandable as a survival strategy for a queen with few native allies she could fully trust, became yet another source of French resentment against her. One more thread in the tapestry of suspicion and foreignness that would follow her for the rest of her life, regardless of how skillfully she governed. This particular resentment toward foreign advisors was hardly unique to Catherine's court, reflecting a broader pattern common across Renaissance European monarchies, in which native nobility routinely viewed the arrival of trusted foreign counselors around a ruler with deep suspicion, regardless of the counselor's actual competence or the genuine political logic behind their employment. Yet the criticism carried particular sting in Catherine's case, layered atop the decades-old resentment toward her own Italian origins that had never fully faded since her arrival as a 14-year-old bride, and reinforced by a persistent undercurrent of gendered suspicion that viewed any woman wielding independent political judgment, foreign-born or not, as inherently more likely to require sinister private counsel than a male ruler exercising the same authority through the same channels. It is a pattern historians have traced across numerous cases of female regency and rule throughout early modern Europe. The same behaviors that earned male monarchs praise for shrewd counsel-seeking earned their female counterparts accusations of secretive, potentially dangerous foreign influence, a double standard Catherine navigated for the entirety of her public life without ever fully escaping its persistent shadow. Among these advisors was her personal astrologer and physician, Cosimo Ruggieri, an Italian who had followed her to the French court and remained close to her for decades, a relationship that scandalized more conservative elements of French society, who viewed astrology and the occult sciences with deep suspicion, even as such practices remained genuinely fashionable among Renaissance elites across Europe, including at the highest levels of the church itself. Catherine's fascination with astrology was, by the standards of her era, neither unusual nor secretive. She consulted charts before major decisions, much as many rulers of her time did, and maintained a well-documented friendship and correspondence with the famed prophet Nostradamus, whose predictions, whether coincidence or genuine foresight, would eerily shadow several of the great tragedies of her reign, beginning with the jousting death of her own husband, which some later claimed the prophet had foreseen in his writings years earlier. It was this fascination, harmless in its own era, that later generations would twist and exaggerate into tales of black magic and secret poison laboratories hidden beneath the Louvre. Evidence, again, of how thoroughly a powerful woman's ordinary interests could be reimagined as evidence of monstrosity by those eager to discredit her. The relationship between Catherine and Nostradamus deserves particular attention, given how thoroughly it has been woven into the popular mythology surrounding her. The physician and astrologer, born Michel de Nostradam in Provence, had achieved considerable fame by the 1550s for his published almanacs and cryptic prophetic verses, and Catherine, sharing the era's widespread fascination with astrology as a legitimate branch of natural philosophy rather than mere superstition, invited him to the French court in 1555, reportedly to cast horoscopes for her young children and to offer counsel on matters of state that she believed might benefit from his particular gifts of foresight. Their relationship, by surviving accounts, remained one of genuine mutual respect across the following years. Catherine maintaining correspondence with him even after he returned to Provence, and reportedly seeking his counsel again in the anxious years following her husband's sudden death, when the eerie accuracy of his earlier prophecy regarding a fatal wound to a king's eye lent his subsequent predictions an unsettling new credibility at court. It is worth noting, for the sake of historical accuracy, that the famous quatrain often cited as predicting Henri II's death, describing a young lion overcoming an old one in single combat, piercing his eyes in a golden cage, was published years before the fatal joust of 1559. And its striking resonance with the actual circumstances of Henry's death has fueled centuries of fascination and debate among those who study Nostradamus's work. Whether interpreted as genuine prophetic insight, remarkable coincidence, or the kind of deliberately ambiguous verse that could plausibly be read as prediction of almost any dramatic royal death after the fact. Whatever the truth of his prophetic gifts, Catherine's genuine and well-documented interest in his counsel reflects less any special inclination toward dark magic, as later legend would insist, than the entirely mainstream Renaissance fascination with astrology that numbered popes, emperors, and virtually every major court in Europe among its devoted practitioners and patrons during this period. Ruling France in 1560 meant ruling a kingdom tearing itself apart from within, and to understand the scale of the challenge Catherine inherited, it helps to step back and consider exactly how deep the religious fracture had already grown by the time she assumed her regency. The Protestant Reformation had swept across northern Europe for 4 decades by the time Catherine took power, transforming the political and religious landscape of Germany, Switzerland, England, and the Low Countries. France had not been immune to its influence, though the specific strain of Protestantism that took root there, the Calvinist theology developed by the French reformer John Calvin, working from exile in Geneva, carried its own distinct character, appealing particularly to segments of the merchant class, the legal profession, and, crucially for the political calculus Catherine faced, to a substantial portion of the French nobility itself. The specific danger the Guise family posed to Catherine's authority throughout her regency, it helps to understand their remarkable rise to prominence in the decades before her son's accession. The House of Guise, a cadet branch of the powerful Lorraine ducal family, had built extraordinary influence at the French court through a combination of military success, strategic marriages, and sheer force of personality, culminating in Duke Francis of Guise's celebrated defense of Metz against Holy Roman Emperor Charles V's forces in 1552, and his recapture of Calais from English control in 1558, victories that made him, for a time, arguably the most popular military figure in the entire kingdom. His brother, Charles, Cardinal of Lorraine, wielded comparable influence within the church and at court through his considerable intellectual gifts and administrative skill, giving the family a rare combination of military prestige and ecclesiastical authority that few other noble houses in France could match. The Guise family's position was further cemented through the marriage of Francis's niece, Mary, Queen of Scots, to Catherine's own eldest son, the future Francis II, a union that placed the Guise family in direct, intimate proximity to the throne itself. And that explains much of the tension between Catherine and the Guise faction during her eldest son's brief reign. The family's staunch Catholic identity, combined with their genuine popularity among the common people of Paris and their considerable private military resources, made them simultaneously invaluable allies and potentially dangerous rivals throughout Catherine's decades in power, a duality she navigated with characteristic care. At times relying on Guy's military strength to suppress Protestant uprisings, at other times working actively to check their ambitions when those ambitions threatened to eclipse royal authority itself. This last group mattered enormously. Unlike Protestant movements elsewhere in Europe, which often drew their strength primarily from urban commoners or from rulers converting entire territories by decree, French Protestantism had taken deep root among powerful noble families who commanded their own private armies, controlled substantial fortified territories, and possessed both the resources and the motivation to defend their religious convictions through open warfare rather than mere theological debate. For decades, the rise of Protestantism, specifically the Calvinist Huguenot movement, had been dividing French nobility and common people alike, setting Catholic and Protestant factions against each other with a hatred that would erupt, again and again, into open warfare. Catherine, whatever else history would say of her, understood from the very beginning that this division threatened everything she had fought to secure. A kingdom at war with itself was a kingdom that could not protect her sons' crowns. Her initial instinct, surprising for a woman raised in the heart of Catholic Italy, cousin to a pope, was not zealotry, but pragmatism. She sought, again and again throughout the early years of her regency, to find a middle path: tolerance edicts that granted Huguenots limited rights to worship, diplomatic marriages meant to bind Catholic and Protestant houses together, careful balancing acts designed to keep any single faction from growing powerful enough to threaten the throne. It was perhaps the most quietly radical thing about her that in an age of religious absolutism, when men on both sides believed compromise was itself a sin, Catherine de Medici tried for years to hold a middle ground built entirely on political survival rather than religious conviction. Historians believe she cared little for theology and enormously for the stability of her son's reign. To her, a live Huguenot loyal to the crown was worth infinitely more than a dead one who created a martyr. This pragmatic instinct extended even to Catherine's own household and inner circle, where she quietly maintained relationships across the religious divide in ways that scandalized more doctrinaire observers on both sides. She corresponded respectfully with prominent Protestant leaders when the situation called for diplomacy rather than confrontation. She permitted and at times actively encouraged marriage alliances between Catholic and Protestant noble houses, believing, with a logic that would prove tragically, catastrophically naive by 1572, that shared family bonds might eventually dampen the appetite for religious slaughter that so much of the French nobility seemed to have developed. She consulted with moderate voices on both sides of the religious divide, including the Chancellor Michel de l'Hôpital, a figure of genuine intellectual sophistication who shared her belief that civil peace mattered more than doctrinal purity, and who worked alongside her throughout the early 1560s to craft policies that might hold the kingdom together. It is worth noting, too, that Catherine's approach reflected something distinctly Italian in its political philosophy, shaped by the Renaissance statecraft tradition she had absorbed during her Florentine childhood, a tradition perhaps best articulated, decades before her birth, by the political theorist Niccolo Machiavelli, whose writings, though controversial and often misunderstood even in their own era, argued that a ruler's primary obligation was the stability and survival of the state itself, sometimes requiring pragmatic compromises that more rigid moral or religious frameworks would never permit. Whether Catherine had read Machiavelli directly remains debated among historians, though the intellectual affinity between her governing style and his political philosophy is difficult to ignore, and it earned her, particularly among English Protestant writers eager to demonize a Catholic queen, direct comparison to the Florentine theorist. Comparisons meant as condemnation that nonetheless captured something genuinely accurate about the transactional, survival-oriented character of her statecraft. but compromise satisfied no one. The Catholic Guy's family saw her tolerance as weakness, even betrayal. The Huguenot leadership, led by figures like the Prince of Conde and later Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, saw her concessions as insufficient and her sincerity as suspect. By 1562, France had descended into the first of what would become 8 brutal civil wars, fought intermittently over the next 3 decades, tearing apart towns, families, and the fragile peace Catherine had tried so desperately to build. The massacre at Vassy, which triggered this first war in March of 1562, illustrates precisely how quickly Catherine's careful balancing act could be shattered by forces entirely beyond her control. The Duke of Guise, travelling through the small town with an armed retinue, encountered a congregation of several hundred Huguenots holding services in a barn, in technical violation of restrictions on Protestant worship within town boundaries under the Edict of January. What began as a confrontation escalated within minutes into outright slaughter, Guise's soldiers killing dozens, by some accounts well over 100 unarmed worshippers, including women and children caught in the chaos. The Duke himself would later claim the violence began when stones were thrown at his men, a justification that satisfied almost no one, and that Huguenot leaders across France immediately, and with considerable justification, rejected as a thin pretext for a premeditated attack. News of Vassy spread through Protestant France with devastating speed, confirming every fear Huguenot leaders had harboured about the true intentions lurking behind the crown's fragile promises of toleration. Within weeks, the Prince of Conde had raised an army, seized the city of Orleans as a Protestant stronghold, and issued a formal declaration justifying armed resistance, not against the young king himself, whose authority Huguenot leaders were careful to claim they still respected, but against what they characterized as the tyrannical influence of the Guise family, who they argued had effectively hijacked royal authority for their own sectarian purposes. It was a legal and rhetorical distinction that mattered enormously to the participants, even as it did little to prevent the war that followed from consuming the kingdom in genuine widespread bloodshed. Catherine, watching this catastrophe unfold within mere months of the careful toleration edict she had fought to establish, found herself trapped between factions that increasingly viewed any compromise as betrayal. She attempted, throughout 1562 and into 1563, to broker a ceasefire, working through intermediaries and eventually meeting personally with key Huguenot leaders in a series of negotiations that finally produced the Edict of Amboise in March 1563. A peace that granted Protestants somewhat reduced toleration compared to the original January edict. A retreat that satisfied hardline Catholics only marginally, while leaving many Huguenot leaders feeling that their sacrifice in the war had purchased less religious freedom than they had held before the fighting even began. It was, in miniature, the pattern that would repeat itself across the following decades. War, exhaustion, a negotiated peace that satisfied no one completely, followed inevitably by the peace's slow collapse and the resumption of open conflict. Perhaps in the candlelit chambers of the Louvre, while reports of massacres and sieges arrived from across her fractured kingdom, Catherine began to understand a darker truth about the France she governed, that some divisions could not be negotiated away, only managed, contained, and when necessary, brutally suppressed. The wars themselves followed a grim and repeating pattern across those years. A Protestant stronghold would rise in the south or west of the country. Catholic forces, sometimes led by the crown, sometimes by the increasingly independent and ambitious Guise family, would move to crush it. Massacres would occur on both sides. Vassy in 1562, where Guise soldiers slaughtered Huguenot worshippers gathered in a barn, is often cited as the spark that ignited the First War outright. Sieges would drag on for months, towns would starve, and eventually, exhausted and financially devastated, both sides would sign a peace edict granting the Huguenots some limited rights, only for the peace to collapse within a year or two, as some new provocation reignited the violence. Catherine, travelling constantly across her fractured kingdom during these years, famously undertaking a grand 2-year royal progress through France between 1564 and 1566, dragging her young son Charles IX to be seen and cheered by his subjects in city after city. In an effort to project stability her government did not truly possess, worked tirelessly and largely thanklessly to broker each fragile peace. She met personally with Huguenot leaders. She negotiated marriage alliances meant to bind rival houses together, including, eventually, the marriage that would trigger catastrophe. Her own daughter Margaret to the young Protestant Henry of Navarre, heir to the small but fiercely independent kingdom that bordered Spain. Perhaps, on the long dusty roads of that royal progress, watching her young son wave from carriage windows at crowds who did not yet understand how fragile the peace they cheered truly was, Catherine allowed herself brief moments of hope that a kingdom this exhausted by war might finally choose exhaustion over further bloodshed. If she did, those hopes would not survive the decade. The grand progress of 1564 to 1566 deserves particular attention for what it reveals about Catherine's distinctive approach to statecraft. A belief, inherited perhaps from her Florentine upbringing, among a family that had always understood spectacle as a genuine instrument of political power, that a kingdom could sometimes be held together through carefully staged displays of unity and royal magnificence even when the underlying political reality remained deeply fractured. The progress included elaborate festivals at Fontainebleau, tournaments, allegorical pageants, and lavish entertainments designed to project an image of stability and reconciliation to both foreign observers and Catherine's own fractious nobility, whatever tensions continued simmering beneath the festive surface. The most consequential stop on this grand tour came at Bayonne in 1565, where Catherine arranged a meeting with representatives of her son-in-law, King Philip II of Spain, including the formidable Duke of Alba, one of the most feared military commanders and staunchest defenders of Catholic orthodoxy in all of Europe. The Bayonne Conference became, in the years that followed, a subject of intense speculation and conspiracy theory among Protestant observers, who came to believe, with little solid evidence, historians now generally agree, though the suspicion proved remarkably persistent, that Catherine and Alba had secretly plotted the eventual extermination of French Protestantism during their private discussions. A supposed conspiracy that later writers would even attempt to connect directly to the massacre that unfolded 7 years later. Most modern historians treat this specific conspiracy theory with considerable skepticism, noting that Catherine's actual policies in the years immediately following Bayonne continued to reflect her characteristic preference for toleration and negotiated accommodation rather than any coordinated plan of extermination. But the persistence of the rumour illustrates, once again, how thoroughly any of Catherine's actions, however innocent their actual content, could be reinterpreted through the lens of the sinister reputation that had already begun attaching itself to her by the mid-1560s. It is worth noting, too, Catherine's celebrated and much discussed use of what later writers would dub her flying squadron, a carefully cultivated circle of beautiful, intelligent, and politically astute young noblewomen whom Catherine placed strategically within her household, trained in the arts of court conversation and diplomatic charm, and deployed, according to numerous contemporary and later accounts, to gather intelligence and influence the loyalties of powerful noblemen whose political leanings mattered to the crown's stability. The precise extent and organization of this arrangement remains debated among historians. some of whom view later accounts as exaggerated or even largely mythical, shaped by the same tendency to attribute sinister, manipulative femininity to Catherine that coloured so much of her broader legend. What does seem well documented is that Catherine understood, with unusual clarity for her era, the genuine political value of information gathered through informal social channels, and that her court, more than most of her contemporaries, made deliberate use of clever, capable women as instruments of statecraft rather than merely as ornamental presences. Itself a quietly radical inversion of how female influence was typically deployed and dismissed at other European courts of the period. Between the First War of 1562 and the catastrophe of 1572, France endured 3 further rounds of open religious warfare, each one somewhat different in character but following broadly similar patterns of escalation, atrocity, exhausted negotiation, and fragile peace. The Second War, in 1567 and 1568, was triggered when Huguenot leaders, alarmed by rumours, likely accurate, that Catherine and the Spanish crown had discussed measures to more forcefully suppress Protestantism throughout Europe, attempted a bold and nearly successful plot to seize the young King Charles IX himself at Meaux, hoping to remove him from what they viewed as dangerous Guise and Spanish influence. The plot failed, but it deepened Catherine's own personal distrust of Huguenot leadership considerably, colouring her approach to religious politics for years afterward with a wariness that had not been quite so pronounced in the earlier years of her regency. The Third War, beginning in 1568 and dragging into 1570, proved especially brutal. Marked by the assassination of the Huguenot military commander, the Prince of Conde, after his surrender at the Battle of Jarnac, shot in cold blood after he had already yielded, an act of battlefield murder that scandalized even some Catholic observers and hardened Protestant resolve considerably. It was during this period that Admiral Gaspard de Coligny rose to become the preeminent Huguenot military and political leader in France, a role that would place him, within a few short years, at the very centre of the catastrophe still to come. The Peace of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, which finally ended this Third War in August 1570, granted Huguenots their most favourable terms yet. Several fortified towns held under Protestant control as guarantee of the crown's good faith, broader rights of worship, and, crucially, renewed access for Huguenot leaders to royal council and influence at court. Catherine, exhausted by nearly a decade of intermittent warfare that had drained the treasury and left the kingdom's infrastructure battered, appears to have genuinely hoped this peace might finally hold, and she worked actively in the years immediately following to cement it, including through the marriage negotiations that would eventually bring her daughter Margaret and the young Huguenot King of Navarre together at the altar. It is worth pausing here to consider Admiral Coligny's growing influence over the young King Charles IX during these years, because it forms perhaps the single most important thread leading toward the catastrophe of August 1572. Charles, temperamentally unstable and eager, by most accounts, for the kind of paternal guidance his own father's early death had denied him, grew genuinely attached to Coligny in the years following the Peace of Saint-Germain, drawn to the admiral's military bearing and apparent sincerity in ways that increasingly excluded his own mother's counsel. Coligny, for his part, began advocating for a bold foreign policy that alarmed Catherine profoundly: a French military intervention in the Netherlands in support of Dutch Protestants rebelling against Spanish Habsburg rule. A policy that risked dragging France into direct war with the most powerful military force in Europe at a moment when the kingdom could least afford it. Coligny's own biography helps explain both the genuine respect he commanded among Huguenot France and the particular threat Catherine came to perceive in his growing influence. Born into an old and distinguished noble family, he had served with distinction as a military commander under Henri II before his conversion to Protestantism in the late 1550s. A conversion that cost him considerable standing at a court, still overwhelmingly Catholic, but that won him enormous loyalty among the growing Huguenot movement, who saw in his conversion a validation of their faith by a man of unimpeachable martial credentials and aristocratic lineage. He had led Huguenot forces through years of civil war with a combination of tactical skill and personal magnetism that made him, by the early 1570s, arguably the single most influential Protestant leader in the kingdom, respected even by many of his Catholic adversaries for his evident personal integrity, whatever their theological disagreements with him. It is worth pausing, too, on the broader social and economic dimensions of the Huguenot movement that Coligny's leadership exemplified, because understanding these dimensions helps explain why the conflict proved so difficult for Catherine or any ruler to resolve through purely political negotiation. French Protestantism drew significant strength from precisely those segments of society experiencing the greatest social and economic transformation during the 16th century. The rising merchant and professional classes in cities like La Rochelle, Lyon, and Rouen, whose growing commercial wealth and literacy made Calvin's emphasis on scripture, personal conscience, and thrift particularly resonant, alongside a substantial portion of the provincial nobility, particularly in the south and west of France, whose more independent, less court-centered traditions made them naturally receptive to a faith that emphasized individual conscience over hierarchical ecclesiastical authority. This meant the religious conflict Catherine faced was never simply a matter of theological disagreement to be resolved through clever diplomatic formulas, but reflected genuine, deep-rooted social and regional divisions within French society that had been building for generations before the Reformation gave them explicit religious expression and organizational structure. The Huguenot movement had also developed by the 1560s a genuinely sophisticated organizational structure, with regional synods coordinating between individual congregations, a network of fortified towns, the so-called places de threat guaranteed under various peace treaties, providing genuine military security independent of royal protection, and an increasingly well-articulated political theology developed by Huguenot theorists in the aftermath of the 1572 massacre that justified armed resistance against a monarch perceived as tyrannical or unjust. This last development proved particularly significant for understanding the political landscape Catherine navigated throughout the final decades of her life. French Protestantism had evolved by the 1570s and 1580s from a persecuted religious minority seeking mere toleration into a genuinely formidable political and military movement with the organizational capacity, ideological justification, and armed strength to sustain resistance against royal authority indefinitely. A reality that made any purely military solution to the religious conflict increasingly implausible. Whatever hardline voices at court continued to advocate for such an approach. Catherine's response to this evolving landscape reflected a governing philosophy she had honed across decades of careful observation. That lasting political stability required constant, patient maintenance rather than dramatic, single decisive strokes. An approach that stood in marked contrast to the more impulsive, honor-driven political culture that characterized much of the French nobility on both sides of the religious divide during this period. She invested enormous energy in personal relationships and correspondence, believing, with some justification given her own life experience, that individual trust and personal loyalty could sometimes accomplish what formal treaties and legal edicts alone could not. She proved willing, again and again, across her decades in power, to make concessions that hardliners on her own Catholic side viewed as dangerously permissive, understanding that the alternative, attempting to crush an increasingly well-organized and militarily capable Protestant movement through sheer force, risked a far more prolonged and destructive conflict than the uneasy, imperfect coexistence her policies generally sought to maintain. This governing philosophy, whatever its ultimate limitations and catastrophic failure in 1572, reflected a genuinely sophisticated understanding of the practical limits of royal power in an era when the crown's ability to enforce its will through pure military coercion remained far more constrained than later, more centralized forms of European monarchy would eventually achieve. Catherine governed a kingdom in which regional nobility retained substantial independent military and financial resources, in which religious conviction motivated genuine mass mobilization on both sides of the conflict, and in which the Crown's own financial resources remained perpetually strained by the accumulated costs of decades of warfare, both foreign and domestic. Within these genuine structural constraints, her preference for negotiation, patience, and calculated compromise over outright military solution represented, by the standards of her era and her actual available options, a remarkably consistent and often genuinely effective approach to governance. One whose occasional, sometimes catastrophic failures should not entirely obscure the decades of relative stability it also managed to produce. It was precisely this combination of genuine popularity, proven military competence, and now growing personal influence over the young king that made Coligny, in Catherine's calculating political assessment, a figure whose continued rise threatened to eclipse her own carefully maintained authority over her son. Whether her fears were fully justified, or whether decades of court survival had trained her to perceive existential threats in any figure who commanded the kind of loyalty from Charles that she herself had spent years cultivating, remains one of the genuinely difficult questions historians continue to wrestle with in assessing her culpability for what followed. Catherine watched this growing rift between herself and her son with mounting alarm. Contemporary accounts describe her working desperately throughout 1571 and into 1572 to counter Coligny's influence over Charles, arguing forcefully in council against the Netherlands' intervention, and growing increasingly convinced that the admiral represented not merely a policy disagreement, but a genuine threat to her own authority over her son, and, by extension, over the kingdom itself. Whether this fear was fully justified, or whether Catherine's own political instincts, honed by decades of court survival, led her toward an overcorrection that proved catastrophically disproportionate, remains one of the most fiercely debated questions among historians studying the massacre's origins. It is here, in the years between 1562 and 1572, that the mythology of Catherine de Medici as the Poisson Queen truly began to calcify into legend. Court gossip, fueled by Huguenot pamphleteers eager to paint the Catholic regent as a monster, and later amplified by generations of dramatists and historians who found her more useful as a villain than as a complicated political survivor, accused her of extraordinary crimes. She was said to keep a cabinet of poisons in her private chambers. She was said to have sent perfumed gloves laced with toxin to rivals, killing them slowly and untraceably. She was said to have poisoned Jeanne d'Albret, the formidable Protestant Queen of Navarre, with a pair of scented gloves before Jeanne's son Henri married Catherine's daughter Margaret in 1572. The Jeanne d'Albret story merits closer examination precisely because it illustrates so clearly how these legends took root and spread. Jeanne, Queen of Navarre and mother of the future Henri III, had been among the most formidable and uncompromising Protestant leaders in France, having personally converted her own kingdom of Navarre to Calvinism, and having raised her son within the Protestant faith, despite considerable political pressure to do otherwise. Her death in June of 1572, only weeks before her son's wedding to Catherine's daughter, and mere months before the massacre that would nearly claim that same son's life, struck contemporaries as suspiciously convenient timing for a queen mother widely believed capable of exactly this kind of calculated elimination of a troublesome rival. The autopsy conducted at the time, according to surviving records, identified lesions in her lung consistent with tuberculosis or a related respiratory ailment, findings that align with what modern medical historians would expect from a woman known to have suffered from chronic ill health for years before her death. Yet the poison rumour proved remarkably durable regardless, propagated by Huguenot writers eager to add one more damning entry to Catherine's growing list of alleged crimes, and repeated so often across subsequent centuries that it hardened in popular memory into something resembling established fact, despite the thinness of the actual evidence supporting it. But the accusations reveal something important nonetheless: how thoroughly Catherine's reputation for ruthlessness had taken hold, and how useful that reputation became, whether or not the specific stories were true. A woman feared for poison, real or imagined, was a woman other rulers hesitated to cross. It is worth pausing here to consider why this particular myth, poison, above nearly every other method of political violence available to a Renaissance ruler, attached itself so persistently to Catherine specifically. Poison was, in the imagination of the era, considered a peculiarly feminine weapon, quiet, indirect, requiring no physical strength, deployable from a position of apparent powerlessness by someone who could smile pleasantly at a victim only hours before their death. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of violence contemporary society expected a dangerous woman to use, regardless of whether she actually did. Male rulers who ordered battlefield slaughter by the thousands were called conquerors, strategists, even heroes. A woman suspected of a single poisoned glove was called a monster. Perhaps in the candlelit chamber of her own private study, surrounded by the astrological charts and Italian correspondence that fed these rumours. Catherine understood this asymmetry perfectly well, and understood too that there was little use fighting a reputation that, however unfair, kept her enemies looking over their shoulders. What is documented, and beyond dispute, is what happened in August of 1572, the darkest and most infamous chapter of Catherine's entire life. The wedding of her daughter Margaret to the Protestant Henry of Navarre was meant to be a symbol of peace, a marriage designed to finally unite Catholic and Protestant France after a decade of bloodshed. On the 18th of August 1572, the ceremony took place on a specially constructed platform outside the doors of Notre Dame Cathedral itself, the bride Catholic, the groom Protestant. Forbidden by his faith from entering the cathedral for the mass that followed, a strange and uneasy compromise that seemed, for one brief golden afternoon, to promise an end to a decade of slaughter. Huguenot nobility flooded into Paris for the celebration in numbers Parisians had never seen. Proud Protestant lords in modest dark clothing, mingling uneasily among a Catholic population that had spent 10 years watching their sons die in religious war. A population that viewed this sudden influx of the very people they blamed for that bloodshed with simmering, barely contained fury. The city itself, in the sweltering heat of a Parisian August, felt to many contemporary observers like a barrel of gunpowder awaiting only a spark. 4 days after the wedding, an assassination attempt against Admiral Coligny, the most powerful Huguenot leader in France, and a man Catherine had come to see as a dangerous rival for her son Charles's loyalty, failed. Wounding, but not killing him. A shot fired from a window struck him in the arm and hand as he walked from the Louvre reading a letter, and though he survived, the attempt threw the entire city into a state of dangerous tension. Huguenot nobles, gathered in Paris in far greater numbers than usual for the wedding, demanded justice and grew openly threatening in their demands. Catholic Paris, already primed for violence by years of religious hatred, watched the standoff with its own mounting dread and fury. The identity of whoever ordered the failed assassination attempt on Coligny remains, even after more than 4 centuries of historical investigation, genuinely uncertain, and it is worth walking through the competing theories carefully, because the answer shapes fundamentally different interpretations of Catherine's culpability in everything that followed. Some historians point to the Guise family as the likely instigators, noting their long-standing personal vendetta against Coligny, whom they held responsible for the earlier assassination of Duke Francis of Guise during the First Religious War, a killing the Guise family had never forgiven or forgotten. Others believe Catherine herself, working perhaps in coordination with the Guise faction or perhaps independently through her own trusted agents, authorized the attempt, motivated by her growing fear of Coligny's influence over Charles and his dangerous push toward war with Spain. Still, others argue the attempt may have originated from Spanish or even Italian interests eager to prevent French intervention in the Netherlands, working through intermediaries whose connections to the French court remain murky in the surviving evidence. What is not disputed is Catherine's reaction once the attempt failed and the political crisis it triggered began spiraling beyond easy containment. Contemporary accounts describe frantic council meetings in the days immediately following the shooting, as Catherine, King Charles, and their closest advisors grappled with a genuinely perilous situation. An assassination attempt against the most powerful Huguenot leader in France, occurring in the very city where thousands of armed and increasingly furious Protestant nobles had gathered for a royal wedding, all of it unfolding under circumstances that made the crown itself appear either complicit or dangerously incompetent. Neither interpretation offering much comfort to a government desperate to avoid renewed civil war. It was in this atmosphere of genuine crisis, historians widely agree, that the fateful decision was made, though precisely who made it, and precisely what its intended scope actually was, remains contested to this day. The traditional account, drawn largely from later testimony and reconstructions that emerged in the massacre's aftermath, holds that Catherine convened an emergency council in the king's presence on the evening of the 23rd of August, and argued forcefully that a small preemptive strike against a handful of key Huguenot leaders, Coligny foremost among them, represented the only way to prevent a far larger Protestant uprising that she and others believed was imminent, whether real or, as some historians now suspect, largely a product of the court's own mounting paranoia. Charles IX, according to these accounts, resisted initially, reportedly consumed by anguish at the prospect of ordering the deaths of men who had, only days earlier, been guests at his own sister's wedding, before finally relenting under his mother's insistent pressure, allegedly crying out in despair that if Coligny was to be killed, then all the Huguenots in France should be killed too, so that none would remain to seek vengeance. A statement, if accurately recorded, that would prove horrifyingly prophetic of what actually unfolded, whether or not Charles intended it as literal command, or merely as an anguished expression of despair. 4 days after the wedding, an assassination attempt against Admiral Coligny, the most powerful Huguenot leader in France, and a man Catherine had come to see as a dangerous rival for her son Charles's loyalty, failed, wounding but not killing him. Historians still debate fiercely who ordered the attempt. Many believe Catherine herself authorized it, fearing Coligny's growing influence over the young king threatened her own authority and risked dragging France into open war with Spain. What happened next spiraled far beyond anyone's control. Fearing Huguenot retaliation for the failed assassination, and reportedly convincing her son Charles IX that a preemptive strike was the only way to protect the crown, Catherine is widely believed to have authorized the killing of a small number of Huguenot leaders in Paris, Coligny among them. But the order, once given, could not be contained. In the pre-dawn darkness of the 24th of August 1572, the feast day of Saint Bartholomew, armed men moved through the narrow streets near the Louvre and struck first at Admiral Coligny himself, dragging the wounded leader from his bed and throwing his body from a window into the street below, where a Catholic mob, some accounts claim, mutilated it further before dragging it through the city. What might have ended there instead ignited something the crown could no longer control. Church bells across Paris. Historians believe the tolling of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois near the Louvre was the signal that spread the violence, rang out through the darkness, and Catholic mobs, inflamed by years of religious hatred and rumour, and perhaps believing they now had royal sanction for a far wider purge than Catherine had ever intended, poured into the streets. Huguenots were dragged from their beds in the homes where they had come to celebrate a royal wedding meant to end the very violence now consuming them. Neighbours turned on neighbours who had lived beside each other for years. The Seine itself, by the accounts of horrified contemporaries, ran choked with bodies for days. Over the following days, thousands of Huguenots, historians estimate between 2,000 and 10,000 across Paris and the provinces where the violence spread, as news of the killing reached other cities and ignited copycat massacres of their own, were slaughtered in the streets. It became known to history as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, one of the darkest atrocities of the entire European Reformation, an event so shocking that even some of Catherine's Catholic allies abroad reportedly recoiled at its scale, while Pope Gregory VI, by contrast, ordered celebratory masses held in Rome upon hearing the news. A stark illustration of just how fractured Europe's response to religious violence had become by the late 16th century. The scale of the killing, once it escaped the narrow, targeted scope Catherine and her council had reportedly intended, becomes almost impossible to convey through simple statistics, though the statistics themselves remain staggering. In Paris alone, over the course of roughly a week of sustained violence, historians estimate that somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 people were killed, their bodies often thrown into the Seine in such numbers that the river reportedly ran visibly discoloured for days afterward, and that fishing from its waters was avoided by superstitious Parisians for weeks. The violence did not remain contained to the capital. As news spread to provincial cities over the following weeks, Catholic mobs in Rouen, Lyon, Orleans, Toulouse, Bordeaux, and numerous smaller towns launched their own massacres of local Protestant populations, sometimes with explicit encouragement from local Catholic authorities, sometimes erupting with no apparent central coordination at all, driven simply by the same volatile mixture of religious hatred and mob psychology that had ignited the violence in Paris itself. When the full scope of provincial killing is included alongside the Parisian massacre, most modern historians place the total death toll somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000, though some contemporary estimates from the era, likely exaggerated in the retelling by both horrified Protestant chroniclers and boastful Catholic ones, ran considerably higher still. Admiral Coligny himself, the massacre's most prominent victim, met his death with a grim, almost ceremonial brutality that contemporary accounts describe in unflinching detail. Roused from his sickbed by armed men who broke into his lodgings in the pre-dawn darkness, he was killed by a group that included, by several accounts, a young nobleman named Charles de Louviers, Sieur de Besme, acting under direct orders traced back to the Duke of Guise' household. His body, thrown from the window as a signal to the waiting mob below and to the Duke of Guise himself, who reportedly stood in the street to confirm his old enemy's death with his own eyes, was subsequently subjected to further mutilation and public display that shocked even hardened contemporary observers accustomed to the era's considerable capacity for violence. His corpse reportedly dragged through the streets, castrated, and eventually hung by the feet at the gallows of Montfaucon. where Parisians came to view the remains of the man who had, only days earlier, stood among the most powerful nobles in the kingdom. Beyond Coligny's own killing, the massacre claimed a number of other prominent Huguenot nobles who had gathered in Paris for the wedding, several of them cut down within the very lodgings the crown had provided for wedding guests, a detail that lent the violence an especially treacherous character in the eyes of horrified contemporaries, men killed not on some distant battlefield where the hazards of religious warfare were at least understood and anticipated, but within the walls of the very city where they had come, under implicit royal safe conduct, to celebrate a marriage meant to end such violence permanently. Henry of Navarre himself, along with his cousin the Prince of Conde, narrowly escaped death only by agreeing, under direct threat, to convert to Catholicism on the spot, a forced conversion both men would later renounce once circumstances allowed, and one that left Navarre effectively a prisoner at the French court for the following several years, held under close watch by the very mother-in-law whose household had so nearly orchestrated his death. Historians remain genuinely divided on a question that bears directly on how the massacre should be understood. Whether the killing represented a long, premeditated plan Catherine and her allies had quietly prepared for months, using the wedding itself merely as convenient cover to gather Huguenot leadership in one vulnerable location, or whether it emerged, as the more widely accepted modern interpretation holds, from a genuine crisis decision made in the panicked hours following the failed assassination attempt on Coligny, a targeted strike that then escaped all control once unleashed upon an already inflamed populace. The premeditation thesis, popular among Huguenot writers in the massacre's immediate aftermath and revived periodically by later historians, points to the suspiciously rapid mobilization of armed men and prepared lists of targets as evidence of advanced planning extending back weeks or months. The more cautious, evidence-based view that has gained increasing acceptance among modern historians notes that no reliable contemporary document has ever surfaced definitively proving such extended premeditation, and that the chaotic, contradictory character of the violence itself targeted killings in some neighborhoods, indiscriminate mob slaughter in others. No clear, coordinated command structure evident once the violence began spreading beyond its first hours, reads far more plausibly as catastrophic escalation from a narrower initial decision than as the smooth execution of a long-laid master plan. Whichever interpretation proves closer to the truth, both accounts implicate Catherine directly in the killing's origins, differing only in the scope and duration of the calculation that preceded it. King Charles IX's own role in these events, and his psychological state throughout, has fascinated and troubled historians for centuries. Some contemporary accounts, likely embellished though rooted in genuine reports from those close to him, claim the king himself fired upon fleeing Huguenots from a palace window during the height of the violence. A story historians increasingly treat with skepticism, but which nonetheless entered the popular mythology surrounding the massacre almost immediately, cementing an image of a crown actively participating in, rather than merely authorizing, the slaughter unfolding in its own capital. What is better documented is the profound psychological toll the massacre appears to have taken on the young king in the months and years that followed. A decline in both physical and mental health that several court physicians and contemporary observers explicitly linked to the horror of what had happened under his authority in August of 1572, whether or not he had personally wielded a weapon during the violence itself. The massacre's aftermath also proved a diplomatic catastrophe of the first order for the French crown across much of Protestant Europe. Queen Elizabeth I of England, upon receiving the French ambassador shortly after news of the killings reached London, reportedly received him in a court draped in mourning black and observed in stony silence, a calculated diplomatic humiliation meant to convey England's horror without formally rupturing relations between the two kingdoms. German Protestant princes, Dutch rebels fighting Spanish Catholic rule, and Swiss cantons all reacted with a mixture of horror and renewed determination, viewing the massacre as final, damning proof that no negotiated peace with Catholic France could ever be fully trusted. For Catherine personally, whatever her precise degree of responsibility for how catastrophically the violence had spiraled beyond its intended scope, the massacre permanently cemented her international reputation as a ruler capable of extraordinary, calculated brutality. A reputation that would follow her and colour interpretations of her entire life and reign for centuries to come. The broader European context surrounding the massacre deserves consideration as well, because Catherine's decisions in August 1572 cannot be fully understood in isolation from the continent-wide religious conflict of which France's civil wars formed only one chapter. To the north, in the Spanish Netherlands, Dutch Protestant rebels had been waging an increasingly bloody war of independence against Habsburg Catholic rule since the late 1560s, a conflict marked by its own horrific atrocities on both sides, including the Spanish sack of numerous Dutch towns. To the south, Spain under Philip II positioned itself as the preeminent defender of Catholic orthodoxy in Europe, watching French religious politics with close and often unwelcome interest, given the two kingdoms' long history of rivalry and Philip's own marriage to Catherine's daughter Elizabeth. To the east, German Protestant princes maintained an uneasy peace with the Holy Roman Empire under the Peace of Augsburg, a fragile settlement that had ended major religious warfare within German territories only 15 years earlier, but had done nothing to resolve the underlying theological and political tensions dividing Catholic and Protestant Europe more broadly. Catherine, whatever her specific missteps and miscalculations in the days leading up to the massacre, was navigating a genuinely treacherous international landscape in which any perceived weakness toward Protestant political power within France risked inviting more aggressive Spanish intervention in French affairs, while any perceived excessive persecution of French Protestants risked provoking the kind of unified Protestant European response that had in other contexts proven capable of sustained and costly warfare. It is this broader context that makes Catherine's decades-long preference for calculated toleration over outright religious war all the more notable. A policy that, whatever its ultimate catastrophic failure in 1572, reflected a genuinely sophisticated understanding of France's precarious position between rival religious and political blocs across the entirety of Reformation-era Europe. Whether Catherine intended a small, targeted political killing that spiraled catastrophically beyond her control, or something far larger from the start, remains one of history's most debated questions. What is certain is that she never publicly expressed regret, and that the massacre cemented, for the rest of her life and for centuries afterward, her reputation as a woman capable of extraordinary ruthlessness in defense of her family's throne. Perhaps in the years that followed, alone in the quiet hours when the screams of that August night must have echoed in memory, Catherine reckoned with what she had unleashed. Or perhaps, as many historians believe, she felt only the cold satisfaction of a threat neutralized, a woman who had learned since the age of 8 that mercy was a luxury the powerful rarely survived long enough to regret withholding. The years following the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre did not bring the peace Catherine had hoped for. If anything, they deepened the wounds tearing France apart, hardening Protestant resistance, and fueling decades more of civil war that would outlast her own life. The immediate diplomatic fallout Catherine had to manage in the months following the massacre deserves attention here, because it illustrates the sheer scale of damage control her government faced, even as the kingdom's internal wounds remained raw and unhealed. Ambassadors were dispatched across Protestant Europe, attempting to frame the killings as a necessary response to an alleged Huguenot conspiracy against the crown, rather than a premeditated act of religious persecution. A diplomatic narrative that persuaded almost no one abroad, but that nonetheless represented the official position the French government maintained for years afterward. Catherine herself corresponded personally with several foreign rulers in the massacre's aftermath, defending the crown's actions in careful, measured language that historians studying these letters find notably devoid of the kind of triumphant satisfaction her later reputation as a calculating monster might lead readers to expect, suggesting instead a ruler keenly aware of the genuine diplomatic and political costs the massacre had inflicted on France's international standing, whatever her private feelings about the domestic political threat it had eliminated. Her son Charles IX, always fragile in body and troubled in mind, reportedly never recovered from the horror of what had happened in Paris under his authority. Historians believe the massacre haunted him for the remainder of his short life. He died in 1574, only 23 years old, of tuberculosis, though inevitably whispers of poison followed this death too, as they followed nearly every death in Catherine's family, whether or not any evidence supported them. Before turning to the final months of Charles's decline, it is worth pausing on a figure whose troubled ambitions defined much of the tension within Catherine's own family during these years. Her youngest son, Francis, Duke of Alenon, and later Duke of Anjou after his older brother's accession. A young man whose restless political ambition and evident jealousy of his more favoured siblings made him, for much of the 1570s and early 1580s, one of the most persistently destabilising figures within Catherine's own household. Denied the clear path to power his brothers enjoyed, Alenon repeatedly flirted with alliance against the crown itself, at one point fleeing court to join forces with Huguenot and moderate Catholic nobles dissatisfied with Henri III's governance. A rebellion that forced Catherine into the uncomfortable position of negotiating, essentially, with her own son, as though he were merely one more fractious noble faction to be managed and placated, rather than family to be trusted. The Peace of Massacre, which ended the Fifth Religious War in 1576, was named with a certain bitter irony after Alenon's own courtesy title. In recognition of the concessions his rebellion had extracted from the crown, a peace purchased, in no small part, by Catherine's own son's willingness to hold the kingdom hostage to his personal ambitions. Catherine's handling of Alenon throughout these years illustrates, in miniature, the particular exhaustion of governing not merely a fractured kingdom, but a fractured family, whose personal rivalries and resentments constantly threatened to spill over into matters of state. She negotiated with him as she negotiated with any other ambitious nobleman, offering titles, territories, and eventually the ill-fated opportunity to pursue sovereignty in the Netherlands that would consume his final years and ultimately contribute to his early death in 1584. A son she had spent years managing more as a political liability than nurturing as a trusted heir, and whose death, whatever complicated feelings it may have stirred, removed the last Catholic alternative to Henry of Navarre's eventual succession. The final months of Charles's illness offer a genuinely poignant coda to the massacre that had, by most contemporary accounts, haunted him ever since. Court physicians recorded a young king increasingly racked by fevers, hemorrhaging, and a wasting sickness that left him a shadow of the vigorous young hunter he had once been. Several accounts, though their reliability is debated, describe Charles suffering from disturbed sleep and troubled visions in his final weeks, tormented by what some contemporaries interpreted as guilt over the massacre. Whether that guilt manifested as genuine remorse for the killing itself, or as horror at having been maneuvered, as he may have come to believe, into authorizing violence on a scale he had never truly intended. Catherine, by every surviving account, remained devotedly at her dying son's bedside, much as she had once remained at his father's, nursing him personally through his final decline in a display of maternal devotion that sits uneasily, for many modern readers, alongside her documented role in the massacre that many historians believe hastened his psychological and physical collapse. It is one of the enduring, unresolved tensions in any honest reckoning with Catherine's character. A woman capable of profound personal devotion to her children, who nonetheless made political choices that, whatever their intended scope, inflicted lasting trauma on at least one of the sons she loved most fiercely. Charles's own son, born to his mistress rather than his wife, and therefore ineligible to inherit the throne, meant the crown now had to pass to Catherine's third son, Henry, who at the time of his brother's death was serving, somewhat improbably, as the newly elected King of Poland-Lithuania, a position secured through delicate diplomatic maneuvering Catherine herself had helped orchestrate only months earlier, intended to provide her favourite son with a throne of his own, even as it now required him to abandon that newly acquired Polish crown and race back to France, to claim the more significant inheritance awaiting him there. Henry's flight from Poland, undertaken secretly and with some diplomatic awkwardness given the Polish nobility's evident displeasure at losing their newly crowned king so abruptly, took several months, during which Catherine herself effectively governed France as regent once again, demonstrating, as she had so many times before, that whatever formal title she held or lacked at any given moment, the actual machinery of French governance still ran, in no small part, through her hands. The crown passed to her third son, Henri III, Catherine's favourite among her children, a man she had groomed carefully for power and continued to advise closely throughout his reign. For the final 15 years of her life, Catherine remained his most trusted counsellor, negotiating endlessly with the great noble factions still tearing at the fabric of the kingdom, the Catholic League led by the powerful Guise family on one side, and the Protestant forces led by Henry of Navarre on the other, with her own son's authority increasingly caught precariously between them. Her son Henry III, unlike his brothers, shared genuine intellectual kinship with his mother. Both were drawn to art, ceremony, and the theatrical trappings of monarchy, and both understood, in ways his brothers never fully grasped, that the appearance of stable authority was itself a form of power. Contemporary observers noted the closeness between mother and son, an emotional bond Catherine had rarely permitted herself with her other children, perhaps because Henry, more than any of his siblings, seemed to genuinely value her counsel rather than merely tolerating it. It is one of the quieter tragedies of her later life that this, her closest relationship with any of her children, would end the way so many of her relationships had, with loss, and with a kingdom she could not fully protect from itself. This period of Catherine's life reveals perhaps the most exhausting truth of her decades in power, that ruling was never a single triumphant seizure of control, but an endless, grinding negotiation that never truly ended. She travelled across France for years, attempting personally to broker peace between warring factions, meeting rival Protestant and Catholic leaders face to face, using marriage proposals, land grants, and sheer force of political will to hold together a kingdom that seemed determined, again and again, to tear itself apart. Henry III's coronation and early reign began, in fact, with a genuine outpouring of hope that this third son might finally prove the capable, stable monarch France had been denied through the sickly reign of Francis II and the troubled, guilt-haunted reign of Charles IX. Henry arrived back from Poland in 1574, already possessing a reputation as a talented military commander, having led royal forces to notable victories against Huguenot armies during the Third Religious War, while still only a teenager, and Catherine, whose favoritism toward this particular son was widely remarked upon by contemporary observers, appears to have genuinely believed he possessed the temperament and intelligence to succeed where his brothers had struggled. The reality of Henry III's reign proved considerably more complicated than these early hopes suggested. He was, by most contemporary accounts, a genuinely intelligent and cultured man drawn to art, literature, and elaborate court ceremony in ways that some contemporaries found admirable and others found frivolous or even suspect, particularly given his fondness for elaborate fashion and a close circle of favoured courtiers, the so-called mignons, whose lavish influence at court and occasionally scandalous conduct became a persistent source of public criticism and satirical pamphleteering throughout his reign. He also suffered, throughout his adult life, from periods of intense religious devotion bordering on what some historians characterize as genuine psychological crisis, undertaking elaborate penitential processions and religious retreats that struck some observers as sincere spiritual anguish, and others as theatrical excess poorly suited to a king who needed, above all, to project stable, confident authority during a period of mounting political crisis. Catherine, watching her favourite son navigate these personal struggles alongside the mounting external pressures of Guise ambition and Huguenot resistance, remained his closest and most consistent advisor throughout the 15 years of his reign. A role she embraced with characteristic energy even as her own physical health began the slow decline that would eventually claim her. Contemporary correspondence between mother and son reveals a relationship of genuine mutual reliance, Henry frequently deferring to his mother's political judgment on matters of genuine consequence even while asserting his own authority in areas where his personal interests and inclinations led him. It was, by the standards of Catherine's often fraught relationships with her other children, among the more successful partnerships of her long political career, which makes the ultimate failure of their combined efforts to preserve stable Valois rule all the more poignant a conclusion to both of their stories. The specific challenge Henry III's reign presented was, in many ways, more complex than anything Catherine had navigated during her son's earlier reigns, because the threat to royal authority no longer came primarily from a straightforward Catholic-Protestant divide, but from a bewildering, shifting landscape of competing factions whose loyalties and motivations grew increasingly difficult to predict. The Catholic League, formally organised in 1576 under the leadership of Henry, Duke of Guise, son of the Duke assassinated years earlier, and a man who had inherited both his father's military talent and his family's fierce ambition, emerged as a powerful political and military force in its own right, nominally loyal to the Crown's Catholic identity, but increasingly willing to act independently of, and even against, the king's own wishes, whenever royal policy seemed insufficiently zealous in defence of the Catholic faith. Meanwhile, Henry of Navarre, the Protestant king who had married Catherine's daughter Margaret amid the catastrophe of 1572, had spent the years since narrowly surviving forced conversion to Catholicism under threat of execution during the massacre itself. Years of uneasy captivity at the French court, where Catherine kept him under close, watchful supervision, and finally a dramatic escape in 1576 that returned him to Protestant territory and, crucially, back to his original Protestant faith, from which his forced conversion had never represented anything more than a desperate survival tactic. From that point forward, Navarre emerged as an increasingly formidable political and military leader of the Huguenot cause, and, critically for the dynastic crisis that would eventually engulf France, as the legal heir presumptive to the French throne itself, since Henry III's marriage had produced no surviving children, and his younger brother, the Duke of Anjou, had died in 1584 without heirs of his own. This last development transformed the entire character of the French religious wars. It was one matter for the Catholic League to oppose Protestant political influence at court or Protestant military strength in the provinces. It was an entirely different, far more explosive matter to contemplate the prospect of a Protestant king inheriting the throne of Catholic France outright, by perfectly legitimate hereditary right, should Henri III die without an heir of his own body. The Catholic League, under Guy's leadership, increasingly organized itself around preventing exactly this outcome, by whatever means proved necessary, placing Catherine and her son Henri III in an agonizingly difficult position, nominally the leaders of Catholic France, yet increasingly distrusted by the very Catholic faction that claimed to act in the Crown's defense, while simultaneously unable to fully reconcile with the Protestant faction whose legal claim to eventual succession they could not simply erase through decree. Catherine, now well into her 60s and increasingly troubled by declining health, nonetheless threw herself into this final great political challenge of her life with characteristic determination, attempting repeatedly to broker some form of accommodation that might satisfy the Catholic League's demands for religious security while preserving Henry of Navarre's legitimate hereditary claim, and above all preserving her own son's authority against a Catholic faction growing bold enough to openly challenge royal decisions. It was, in many ways, the most difficult diplomatic tightrope of her entire career, requiring her to negotiate simultaneously with a Protestant son-in-law she had once held captive, a Catholic League leader whose family she had clashed with for decades, and her own son, the king, whose judgment and political instincts she had come, by this point, to trust rather less than she once had. In the final years of the 1580s, Catherine undertook what many historians consider one of the most remarkable diplomatic efforts of her entire career. A personal journey, undertaken despite her advanced age and declining health, to meet directly with Henry of Navarre in an attempt to negotiate some form of settlement that might avert the dynastic catastrophe both she and increasingly her son could see approaching. The negotiations, conducted across several meetings in 1586, tested Catherine's diplomatic skills against a man who had grown, in the years since his dramatic escape from her custody, into a genuinely formidable political operator in his own right. Well practiced in the art of appearing conciliatory, while conceding almost nothing of substance. Contemporary accounts describe the two engaging in lengthy, cordial, and ultimately fruitless discussions. Henry politely deflecting Catherine's proposals that he convert once more to Catholicism in exchange for guaranteed succession rights, understanding, with a political shrewdness that mirrored Catherine's own, that his Protestant identity remained his primary source of leverage and loyal support, not a liability to be casually traded away. It is one of the quieter ironies of Catherine's final years that her greatest diplomatic adversary in this last chapter of her life was a man who had, in some meaningful sense, learned his own political education, partly by observing her. A son-in-law who had spent years as her captive and pupil at the French court, absorbing, whether she intended to teach him or not, considerable lessons in the patient, calculating statecraft for which she had become famous. When he eventually did convert to Catholicism years later, following Catherine's own death, it would be on his own terms and at a moment of his own choosing, accompanied by his famously pragmatic remark that Paris was well worth a mass. A statement that, in its cold-eyed calculation of political necessity over rigid ideological conviction, could almost have been spoken by Catherine herself. The personal cost of this endless struggle was immense. Of her 10 children, most predeceased her, or suffered the kind of tragedy that seemed, to a superstitious court already inclined to see dark magic in her every move, like a curse following the family. Her son, the Duke of Anjou, Catherine's youngest surviving son, had spent years as a genuinely ambitious and capable political and military figure in his own right. At one point even courted as a potential husband for Elizabeth I of England in a diplomatic romance that occupied years of careful negotiation before ultimately coming to nothing, and had briefly held sovereignty over the Netherlands during the Dutch revolt against Spain before that venture too collapsed amid local resentment of his overreaching ambitions. His death from illness in 1584, without any heir to succeed him, eliminated the last Catholic Valois alternative to Henry of Navarre's succession, and threw the dynastic crisis facing France into its sharpest possible relief, removing at a stroke any hope Catherine might have harboured of keeping the throne within a Catholic branch of her own bloodline. Her daughter Margaret's marriage to Henry of Navarre, the very union meant to symbolise peace, collapsed into decades of bitterness, separation, and scandal. The couple, thrown together by political necessity rather than affection from the very beginning, proved spectacularly ill-suited to one another, and their relationship deteriorated across the 1580s into a pattern of mutual infidelity, public humiliation, and eventually outright estrangement, with Margaret living for extended periods separate from her husband and at one particularly dramatic juncture, briefly imprisoned by her own brother Henri III for scandalous conduct that embarrassed the crown. Catherine, who had personally negotiated this marriage as the capstone of her efforts toward religious reconciliation, watched it unravel across the very years when the political stakes of the union, Navarre's position as heir to the throne, made its failure all the more painful and consequential. Her eldest daughter, Elizabeth, married young to King Philip II of Spain in another of Catherine's carefully constructed dynastic alliances, died in 1568 during childbirth, only 22 years old. A loss Catherine reportedly mourned with particular intensity, having maintained close and affectionate correspondence with her daughter throughout the years of her Spanish marriage. Her daughter Claude, married to the Duke of Lorraine, died in 1575, worn down, historians believe, by the physical toll of repeated childbirth. Of Catherine's 10 children, only 4 would survive her, and of those 4, only her daughter Margaret would outlive the century, dying finally in 1615. Long after the Valois dynasty her mother had fought so desperately to preserve had already passed from history entirely. It is worth naming, too, the children whose lives ended before they ever reached an age where their own stories could fully unfold. The son Louis, who died in infancy. The twin daughters Victoire and Jane, whose difficult birth nearly claimed Catherine's own life alongside theirs. And Francis, her eldest, whose brief 18 months as king ended before he had truly begun to govern in anything but name. A modern reader, accustomed to far lower rates of infant and childhood mortality, may find it easy to treat these losses as a mere historical footnote, the ordinary statistical background of any large 16th century family. But surviving letters suggest Catherine felt each loss acutely, writing of her grief in terms that read, across 4 centuries, as entirely recognizable and entirely human, a mother's sorrow, unmediated by crown or title, however thoroughly the rest of her life was consumed by exactly those burdens. Perhaps, in the quiet hours of her final years, Catherine understood something that all her political genius could never fully protect her from. That a woman who built her power entirely around securing her children's thrones would ultimately watch nearly all of them die before her. The throne she had fought so hard to preserve slipping, piece by piece, beyond her ability to control. There is something worth dwelling on in the sheer accumulated weight of grief Catherine carried by the final decade of her life. A mother who had buried, by the time of her own death, 6 of her 10 children, alongside a husband she had mourned in genuine if complicated sorrow, and countless political allies and rivals whose deaths, whether by natural causes, battlefield violence, or assassination, had punctuated nearly every year of her long public life. Contemporary accounts describe her continuing to wear the black mourning clothes she had first adopted upon Henry II's death for the remainder of her own life. A visible, walking testament to the losses that had accumulated around her, even as she continued, with what many historians regard as genuinely remarkable resilience, to engage actively in the political struggles consuming her kingdom. Perhaps it is this quality above all others, not ruthlessness, not cunning, but sheer, dogged endurance in the face of accumulated personal catastrophe, that most distinguishes Catherine de Medici from the two-dimensional poisoner of popular legend. A woman who simply refused, across 7 decades and against every reasonable expectation the world had set for her, to stop governing, to stop negotiating, to stop trying, however imperfectly, to hold together what remained of the family and kingdom she had spent her entire life fighting to protect. By the mid-1580s, the Catholic League, led by the ambitious House of Guise, had grown powerful enough to directly challenge her son Henri III's authority, and by extension, everything Catherine had spent nearly 3 decades building. She continued to negotiate, continued to maneuver, continued to try to hold together a kingdom that increasingly seemed beyond any single person's ability to save. An aging Queen Mother, now in her late 60s, still working tirelessly to protect a throne that fewer and fewer of her enemies feared as they once had. Her physical decline during these final years is worth dwelling on, if only because it stands in such stark contrast to the formidable political reputation she had spent decades constructing. Court physicians' records and contemporary correspondence describe a woman increasingly afflicted by respiratory ailments, likely the early stages of the pleurisy and tuberculosis-related illness that would eventually claim her life, as well as chronic gout that made travel, once one of her greatest political tools, increasingly agonizing. She continued nonetheless to insist on personal involvement in negotiations that a lesser or less determined ruler might have delegated entirely to subordinates, dictating letters from her sickbed, receiving foreign ambassadors even during periods of considerable physical discomfort, and maintaining, through sheer force of will, an active role in governance that her body increasingly struggled to support. Several contemporary observers, including the Venetian ambassadors whose detailed dispatches remain such valuable historical sources, noted with evident admiration the sheer stamina Catherine displayed even as her physical condition visibly deteriorated. A woman who had spent her entire adult life proving skeptics wrong about her capabilities, apparently determined to continue doing so even as age and illness mounted their own quiet campaign against her. It is difficult not to read a certain grim symbolism into this final chapter. The kingdom itself, fracturing under pressures increasingly beyond any single ruler's ability to fully contain. Mirrored in the body of the woman who had spent 3 decades trying to hold both together through sheer determination and political skill. The woman once so feared for her ruthlessness now found herself, in her final years, negotiating from a position of weakening rather than growing strength. A shift that must have felt to a survivor who had spent her entire life ensuring she was never underestimated again. Like the cruelest irony of all, there is a particular passage, often cited by historians describing Catherine in these later years, an aging woman, her body increasingly heavy and afflicted with gout and respiratory illness, still insisting on being carried in a litter from town to town across France to conduct negotiations in person, refusing the comfort of remaining in Paris while her kingdom burned around her. Even in physical decline, she trusted no one else to manage the delicate, exhausting work of peacemaking that had defined her entire regency. Perhaps, in the swaying darkness of that litter on some muddy provincial road, she reflected on the strange arc of her life. A girl once carried as a hostage through besieged Florence, Now carried as a queen mother through a kingdom she had spent 30 years trying to hold together, the method of her transport unchanged even as everything else about her circumstances had transformed entirely. She also, in these years, continued to serve as a devoted patron of the arts and architecture that had defined her Florentine upbringing, commissioning the construction of the Tuileries Palace, adjacent to the Louvre, as a grand new residence reflecting the Italian Renaissance architectural sensibilities she had carried with her since childhood. Though political and financial pressures meant she would never see the ambitious project completed in her lifetime. She continued, too, to host the elaborate court ballets and festivals for which her reign would later be remembered fondly by cultural historians, even as political historians debated her legacy in far harsher terms. Among the most celebrated of these productions was the Ballet Comique de la Reine, staged in 1581 to celebrate a court wedding, a lavish theatrical spectacle combining dance, music, and elaborate scenic design that many dance historians consider among the foundational works in the development of what would eventually become classical ballet as a distinct European art form, a legacy stretching, in an unbroken if often unacknowledged line, from Catherine's Florentine-inflected court entertainments to the grand ballet traditions that would flourish in France for centuries afterward. It is one of the enduring contradictions of her character, a woman capable of authorizing devastating political violence, who nonetheless spent enormous energy and resources cultivating beauty, spectacle, and artistic patronage throughout a kingdom otherwise consumed by war. Perhaps believing, as her Medici ancestors had believed in Florence generations before her, that art and culture were themselves instruments of power, ways of projecting stability and legitimacy even when the underlying reality was anything but stable. Beyond the Tuileries and the celebrated ballets, Catherine's architectural patronage extended to significant renovation and expansion work at Chenonceau after she reclaimed it from Diane de Poitiers, adding a magnificent gallery spanning the River Cher that transformed the Château into one of the most celebrated residences in France, a physical monument to her ultimate triumph over the rival who had once eclipsed her so thoroughly. She also maintained and expanded the Royal Library, continuing a tradition of manuscript and book collection that stretched back through generations of French and Medici patronage alike, amassing a personal collection that reflected her own genuine intellectual interests in history, astrology, and classical literature, and that would eventually form part of the foundational collections of what became the great French National Library system centuries later. Her patronage extended as well to individual artists and craftsmen, many of them fellow Italians whom she brought to France or supported once already established there, contributing to what art historians recognize as a significant cross-pollination between Italian Renaissance and French artistic traditions during this period. A cultural legacy that, whatever the darker chapters of her political reign, left French decorative arts, garden design, and court entertainment permanently enriched by the Florentine sensibilities she had carried with her since childhood and never fully relinquished, even across 5 decades spent building a life and a reputation on entirely French soil. The years leading up to this final crisis had seen the Catholic League grow into something approaching a rival government within France itself. In 1585, the League, backed by Spanish gold and led by the ambitious Duke of Guise, had effectively forced Henri III's hand through the Treaty of Nemours, compelling the king to formally revoke the toleration Huguenots had won through decades of warfare and negotiation, and to declare Henry of Navarre ineligible to inherit the throne despite his legitimate hereditary claim. It was a humiliating capitulation for a reigning king to make to his own subjects, and Catherine, who had spent decades trying to broker exactly the kind of religious accommodation the treaty now dismantled, watched the agreement's signing with what historians believe was genuine private dismay, even as she understood, with her characteristic pragmatic clarity. That Henry III's political position had grown too weak by this point to resist League pressure entirely. The so-called War of the Three Henrys that followed, pitting King Henry III against both Henry of Navarre's Protestant forces and Henry of Guise's Catholic League, an almost absurdly tangled three-way conflict that captured, in its very name, the chaotic factional collapse of royal authority by the late 1580s culminated in the humiliating Day of the Barricades in May 1588, when Parisian citizens loyal to the Catholic League rose up and effectively drove King Henry III from his own capital, forcing him to flee the city he nominally ruled in order to avoid capture by his own, increasingly emboldened subjects. It was, for a king already struggling to maintain authority, a devastating public humiliation, and it convinced Henry I, historians widely agree, that more drastic measures were required if he hoped to reclaim genuine control over his kingdom. In December of 1588, Catherine de Medici's son, Henry III, made a decision that would define the final months of her life and cast a long shadow over her legacy. Faced with the escalating threat of Henry, Duke of Guise, leader of the Catholic League, and a man many believed intended to seize the throne itself, King Henry III had the Duke assassinated at the Château de Blois. Catherine, by this point gravely ill and largely confined to her bed, reportedly learned of the killing only after it had already taken place. Historians believe she was horrified, not necessarily by the violence itself. A woman who had authorized killings of her own understood the brutal calculus of power better than almost anyone alive, but by the political catastrophe she immediately recognized it would unleash. The Guise family commanded fierce loyalty across Catholic France. Killing their leader without her careful, decades-honed diplomatic groundwork risked igniting exactly the kind of uncontrolled chaos she had spent her entire life trying to prevent. She was right to fear it. The assassination shattered what remained of the fragile peace she had spent years constructing, plunging France into renewed and even more vicious civil war. It would be, though she could not have known it in her final weeks, one of the last great political catastrophes she would witness. The manner of the Duke of Guise's death, when the details reached Catherine's sick room, must have carried a particular bitter resonance for a woman who had spent her entire political life studying exactly this kind of calculated violence. Henry III had summoned Guises to a private council meeting at the royal Château, ostensibly for ordinary business, and had stationed a group of loyal guardsmen, the so-called 45. An elite personal guard the king had assembled specifically for his own protection amid the chaos of the Catholic League's growing power, in the corridors and antechambers surrounding the council room. When Guise arrived and attempted to pass through to the king's chamber, the guardsmen fell upon him with swords and daggers, killing him within feet of the royal apartments in a scene of sudden, brutal violence that echoed, in its calculated intimacy, the very political murders Catherine herself had once been accused of orchestrating decades earlier. Henry III reportedly viewed his rival's corpse personally afterward, remarking, according to several contemporary accounts, that he finally felt like a king again. A statement that captures both the desperation driving the assassination and the crushing weight of humiliation the Catholic League's dominance had inflicted upon him in the years leading up to it. Catherine, informed of the killing while confined to her sickbed, reportedly responded not with satisfaction, but with something closer to dread. Understanding immediately, and with far greater clarity than her son, seemed to possess exactly how catastrophically this single act of violence would destabilize whatever fragile balance remained in the kingdom. She is said to have told her son, upon learning what he had done, that he had better be prepared to rule now, for he had cut himself off from any possibility of accommodation with the Catholic League that had, until that moment, still represented at least a theoretical path toward negotiated stability. Whether these exact words were spoken as later chroniclers recorded them, the sentiment they capture aligns closely with everything historians know of Catherine's political instincts. A lifetime spent understanding that violence, however satisfying or even necessary it might feel in the moment, always carried consequences that rippled forward in ways the immediate actors rarely fully anticipated. Paris itself, upon receiving news of the beloved Catholic League leader's assassination, erupted into fury against the crown. The weeks immediately following the assassination brought Henri III, and by extension, his ailing mother, into an almost unimaginable political isolation. The king who had once commanded the loyalty of the most powerful kingdom in Europe now found himself effectively besieged within his own realm. His authority openly repudiated by his capital city, his treasury strained by years of warfare, and his only viable remaining military alliance resting, with considerable irony, on the Protestant cousin whose exclusion from the succession had been the very cause Kilbury the Catholic League had organised itself around opposing. Henri III and Henry of Navarre formally allied their forces in April of 1589, combining armies to march on Paris itself in an attempt to reclaim the capital from League control, an alliance that would have seemed almost unthinkable only months earlier, and one that illustrated just how thoroughly the assassination of Guise had scrambled the political calculations that had governed French politics for the better part of a decade. Catherine, confined increasingly to her sickbed at Blois, even as these dramatic events unfolded around her, reportedly followed developments with the same close attention she had brought to political crises throughout her entire adult life, dictating letters and receiving reports even as her own physical strength continued its inexorable decline. Whether she lived to see the formal alliance between her son and her former captive son-in-law remains a matter of some historical uncertainty, given the narrow window of weeks separating these events from her own death, but historians generally agree that she understood, in her final lucid days, the essential shape of the crisis her son now faced, a crisis that would, within mere months of her own death, claim Henri III's life as well, brought down by an assassin's blade in a killing that eerily mirrored the political violence that had defined so much of his mother's own turbulent reign. The Sorbonne, France's most prestigious centre of theological learning, issued a formal declaration releasing French Catholics from their obligation of loyalty to King Henri III, an extraordinary repudiation of royal authority by the kingdom's own religious establishment. Catholic League cities across France, including Paris itself, effectively seceded from royal authority in the weeks that followed, and Henri III found himself, remarkably, a king without meaningful control over his own capital, forced into uneasy alliance with the very Protestant cousin, Henry of Navarre, whose exclusion from the succession the crown had so recently, and at such cost, tried to enforce. The broader map of France by early 1589 illustrates just how thoroughly the kingdom had fractured along competing lines of loyalty. Much of the north and east, along with Paris itself, remained firmly under Catholic League control, governed in practice by local league committees and sympathetic nobility, who recognized little meaningful obligation to a crown they viewed as having forfeited its legitimacy through the killing of their beloved duke. The south and west remained largely under Huguenot control, the territories Henry of Navarre had spent years consolidating through his own considerable military and political skill. Henry III himself commanded loyalty primarily from moderate Catholics, the so-called politiques, a faction that had grown considerably during the preceding decades, made up of nobles and officials who, whatever their personal religious convictions, had come to prioritize the stability and unity of the French state over strict religious conformity. A political philosophy that owed no small debt to the pragmatic, stability-focused governing instincts Catherine herself had modelled throughout her decades in power. Even if her own catastrophic missteps in 1572 had done so much to undermine trust in exactly this kind of moderate accommodation. The eventual resolution of this crisis, though Catherine did not live to see it, deserves brief mention here for the sense of narrative closure it offers to a story she spent her entire adult life trying to shape. Following Henri III's own assassination in August 1589, Henry of Navarre's claim to the throne, however fiercely contested by the Catholic League in the years immediately following, gradually gained acceptance as the exhausted kingdom, after decades of religious warfare, increasingly craved stability above continued ideological conflict. Navarre's pragmatic conversion to Catholicism in 1593, followed by the Edict of Nantes in 1598, which finally granted French Protestants a broader and more durable degree of religious toleration than any of Catherine's own edicts had managed to secure or sustain, brought, at last, something resembling the lasting religious peace Catherine had spent 3 decades pursuing through means that had so, often proven tragically insufficient to the task. It is one of history's more poignant ironies that the peace Catherine could never quite achieve during her own lifetime was ultimately secured by the very son-in-law whose succession she had spent years trying to prevent, using precisely the kind of pragmatic religious compromise that had always defined her own political instincts, even when those instincts failed her most catastrophically. Catherine de Medici died on the 5th of January 1589 at the Château de Blois at 69 years old, an extraordinary age for the era, achieved despite decades of political warfare, personal tragedy, and constant physical strain. The cause was likely pleurisy, complicated by the tuberculosis that had plagued her for years, though even in death, some whispered darker explanations. Unable to imagine so formidable a woman succumbing to something as ordinary as illness. France was in such turmoil at the time of her death, consumed by the civil war her son's assassination of the Duke of Guise had ignited, that Catherine could not even be given the elaborate royal burial her position warranted. Her body was initially interred without the ceremony a Queen Mother of France might have expected, a final indignity for a woman who had spent her entire life ensuring she was never treated as less than she deserved. Her son Henri III would survive her by only 8 months, assassinated in August of 1589 by a fanatical Catholic monk named Jacques Clement, who believed he was carrying out God's judgment against a king who had ordered the killing of the Duke of Guise. The assassin gained access to the king under the pretense of delivering secret documents and stabbed him in the abdomen with a hidden blade, a death that, in its sudden, intimate violence, echoed uncomfortably with the calculated killings Henry's own mother had once been accused of ordering. As though the currency of political murder Catherine had spent decades navigating had, in the end, been turned against her own bloodline entirely. It brought an end to the Valois dynasty that Catherine had spent nearly 30 years desperately trying to preserve. The throne passed, ultimately, to her son-in-law Henry of Navarre, the Protestant King Catherine had spent decades trying to neutralize, negotiate with, and outmaneuver, who now became Henri IV of France, founder of the Bourbon dynasty that would rule France for the next 2 centuries. In the end, despite every alliance forged, every rival eliminated, every careful maneuver executed across 3 decades of ruling France in her sons' names, the throne Catherine de Medici had fought so ferociously to protect for her own bloodline passed instead to the family of a man she had spent her life trying to contain. Perhaps history's cruelest irony of all, that the woman so feared for her ability to control outcomes could not, in the final accounting, control the one outcome she had wanted most. Consider, too, the strange quiet of her actual final days at Blois. A queen who had spent decades surrounded by the noise of court intrigue, foreign ambassadors, warring nobles, and the endless demands of 5 reigning children, dying instead in relative isolation, her body failing faster than the physicians around her could explain. While outside her chamber windows, a kingdom she had spent her entire adult life trying to hold together tore itself apart over an assassination she had not ordered and could not have prevented. Historians who have studied the accounts of her final weeks describe a woman who remained, even then, sharp of mind and attentive to the reports still reaching her sickbed, dictating letters, offering counsel to her son when he visited, unwilling, even at the very end, to fully release the reins of a government she no longer had the strength to hold. The Chaux de Blois itself, where Catherine spent her final months and where the fateful assassination of the Duke of Guise had taken place only weeks before her own death, offers a haunting backdrop for the closing chapter of her extraordinary life. The Chaux, one of the great architectural jewels of the Loire Valley, had witnessed some of the most consequential moments of her decades in power, and it seems, in retrospect, a fittingly dramatic, if melancholy, setting for a life that had been defined, from its earliest days in besieged Florence, by the constant uneasy proximity between splendor and violence, between the outward magnificence of royal power and the often brutal calculations required to maintain it. Her funeral arrangements, delayed and ultimately conducted with far less ceremony than her position warranted, reflected the genuine chaos consuming the kingdom in the weeks following her death. Her body was initially placed in a modest tomb at Blois, rather than transported immediately to the royal necropolis at Saint-Denis, where French monarchs and their consorts were traditionally laid to rest. A delay attributable partly to the dangerous political instability gripping the roads and cities between Blois and Paris, and partly, some historians suggest, to a simple lack of resources and attention amid a court consumed by more immediately pressing crises. It would be years before her remains were finally transferred to Saint-Denis to rest alongside her husband Henri II. A posthumous indignity that stands in striking, almost poignant contrast to the extraordinary care and attention she had devoted, throughout her life, to the proper ceremonial dignity of the crown she had spent 3 decades defending. There is a further, stranger indignity worth recording here, one that later chroniclers found almost too fitting to be believed. Local tradition in Blois held that Catherine's heart was separately interred at a Parisian church, while her body itself, following the chaos of the wars that consumed France in the years after her death, was reportedly disturbed and its bones scattered during the later revolutionary upheavals that swept through France 2 centuries afterward, when angry crowds broke open the royal tombs at Saint-Denis and desecrated the remains of monarchs regardless of the particular reputation, good or ill, any individual ruler had left behind. It is a strange final coda to a life spent so thoroughly consumed by questions of power, legacy, and the careful management of reputation. A body that, even in death, could not entirely escape the turbulence that had defined the era and the dynasty it had spent 70 years navigating. History has rarely been kind to Catherine de Medici, and much of that unkindness, historians now believe, says more about the era that judged her than about the woman herself. It is worth considering, in some detail, exactly how the black legend surrounding Catherine took shape and calcified over the centuries following her death, because the process reveals as much about the politics of historical memory as it does about the woman herself. In the immediate aftermath of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, Huguenot writers in exile, many of them highly educated, politically sophisticated men with access to printing presses throughout Protestant Europe, produced a wave of pamphlets and treatises portraying Catherine not merely as a political actor responsible for a specific atrocity, but as the personification of Italian Machiavellian cunning transplanted onto French soil. A foreign poisoner whose entire life's work had been the systematic corruption of French governance for her own family's benefit. One of the most influential of these works, a treatise sometimes attributed to the Huguenot writer Henri Estienne, catalogued a lengthy and largely unsubstantiated list of alleged crimes, blending genuine historical events with outright invention in ways that proved nearly impossible to disentangle for later generations of readers who lacked access to more careful historical scholarship. The specific mechanics of how these accusations spread and calcified deserve some attention as well. Printing technology, still relatively new but rapidly expanding in reach and influence throughout the 16th century, allowed pamphlet literature to circulate across national and linguistic boundaries with a speed and scale that earlier centuries of political scandal and rumour-mongering had never achieved. A pamphlet printed in Geneva or Basel condemning Catherine's alleged crimes could, within months, find translated circulation in London, Amsterdam, and the Protestant territories of Germany, reaching an educated reading public increasingly primed by decades of religious conflict to believe the very worst of a Catholic queen regent whose policies, whatever their actual complexity and frequent moderation, could easily be caricatured as evidence of deep-seated hostility toward Protestant believers throughout Europe. This propaganda tradition proved remarkably durable, in part because it served useful purposes for multiple audiences across subsequent centuries. French Protestant historiography, understandably shaped by generations of persecution that followed the Massacre, had every reason to preserve and amplify Catherine's villainous reputation. Enlightenment-era writers, generally skeptical of both monarchy and the Catholic Church, found in Catherine a useful symbol for critiquing the corruption and cruelty they associated with the absolutist governments of the era. 19th-century Romantic novelists and playwrights, most famously Alexandre Dumas in his sweeping historical novels, found her an irresistibly compelling villain, dramatically useful, precisely because the existing mythology already provided such rich, lurid material to draw upon. Poison, conspiracy, dark magic, ruthless political calculation, all wrapped in the added exoticism of her Italian origins. By the time modern professional historians began attempting a more rigorous, source-based reassessment of Catherine's actual historical record in the 20th century, they were working against nearly 400 years of accumulated legend that had thoroughly saturated popular understanding of her life. This reassessment gained particular momentum through the meticulous archival work of historians who, beginning in earnest in the mid-20th century, undertook the painstaking task of examining Catherine's actual surviving correspondence, thousands of letters spanning decades of her political career, preserved in French national archives and various European collections, offering a far more intimate and administratively detailed picture of her actual governing style than the sensationalized pamphlet literature had ever attempted to convey. These letters reveal a ruler concerned with the granular, unglamorous details of governance, negotiating grain prices during famine years, adjudicating property disputes between minor nobles, managing the logistics of royal progresses and diplomatic receptions, and maintaining extensive correspondence with regional governors across a kingdom whose administrative unity remained, throughout her regency, a genuinely fragile and constantly maintained achievement rather than any natural or automatic state of affairs. This correspondence also reveals, in ways the propaganda literature of her enemies could never acknowledge, the sheer daily volume of decisions a regent of her era was expected to manage personally, a burden that fell on Catherine for the better part of 3 decades, whether formally titled regent or simply the power behind whichever son currently held the crown. Historians who have catalogued the surviving letters estimate that Catherine's personal correspondence across the full span of her political career numbers well into the thousands of individual pieces, an output that speaks to a work ethic and administrative diligence rarely acknowledged in the popular imagination of a queen, more commonly remembered for poison and intrigue than for the exhausting, unglamorous labour of actually keeping a fractured kingdom governed. The picture that emerges from this more careful documentary record is not one that entirely exonerates Catherine of the darker episodes of her reign. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre remains, by any reasonable historical standard, a genuine atrocity for which she bears substantial responsibility, whatever the precise scope she originally intended when the fateful decision was made. But it does suggest a far more complex historical figure than the cartoonish poisoner of popular legend. A woman navigating genuinely difficult political circumstances with a combination of pragmatic calculation, occasional catastrophic misjudgment, and a persistent, well-documented commitment to negotiated peace that, however often it ultimately failed, distinguished her approach from many of her more ideologically rigid contemporaries on both sides of France's religious divide. She governed France in various capacities for nearly 3 decades, an almost unimaginable span of authority for any woman of the 16th century, achieved not through inherited right, but through sheer political endurance in a court and a kingdom that had never intended to grant her any power at all. The legend of the Poissonner Queen, the perfumed gloves, the black magic, the countless secret murders, has been largely dismantled by modern historians who point out how conveniently this mythology served her enemies. A foreign-born woman ruling in her sons' names, in an age deeply suspicious of female political power, was an irresistible target for propaganda. Huguenot pamphleteers eager to discredit a Catholic regent, and later generations of writers who found her more compelling as a villain than as a complicated survivor, built a reputation that outlived the facts by centuries. Modern historical scholarship, drawing on more careful examination of surviving letters, financial records, ambassadorial dispatches, and administrative documents from Catherine's actual regency, has produced a considerably more complicated portrait than the Poisoner Queen of popular legend. Historians such as R.J. Knecht and Leonie Frieda, among others who have undertaken comprehensive modern biographical studies of Catherine's life, generally conclude that while she was undoubtedly capable of ruthless political calculation, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre stands as undeniable evidence of that capacity, whatever the precise scope she originally intended. The specific accusations of habitual poisoning that dominated her legend for centuries rest on remarkably thin evidentiary foundations, more a reflection of the era's deep anxiety about powerful women wielding political authority than of any documented pattern of actual behavior. What remains, once the myths are set carefully aside, is perhaps more remarkable than the legend itself. A woman orphaned within weeks of her birth, imprisoned and threatened with death as a child, humiliated for decades in a marriage that offered her no love and little respect, who nonetheless outlasted nearly every rival who underestimated her, and held together, however imperfectly, however violently at moments, a kingdom teetering constantly on the edge of collapse. She was not, historians increasingly agree, a woman who set out to be cruel for cruelty's sake. She was a woman who understood, with a clarity forged in childhood's siege and decades of court humiliation, that mercy was a luxury rarely extended to women who held power, and even more rarely extended by them to those who threatened it. She made devastating choices, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre chief among them, that she never publicly regretted, and that historians continue to debate and reckon with even now, more than 4 centuries later. It is worth considering, in closing this reckoning, what Catherine's story reveals about the particular bind facing capable women in positions of contested authority throughout history, a bind that extends well beyond the specific circumstances of 16th century France. A male ruler who ordered the same political killing Catherine authorized in August 1572 would very likely be remembered today primarily as a hard-nosed political realist. Perhaps criticized for the massacre's catastrophic scope but rarely reduced, across 4 centuries of subsequent memory, to nothing more than that single decision. Catherine, by contrast, found her entire 70-year life, the childhood siege, the decades of patient endurance, the genuine administrative competence, the sustained pursuit of religious compromise across 3 decades of nearly impossible circumstances, collapsed again and again into the single damning caricature of the poisoner queen, as though nothing else about her existence carried sufficient weight to complicate that verdict. This is not an argument for excusing what she did. It is an observation about how differently history has chosen to remember a woman's ruthlessness compared to a man's, and about how much of Catherine's genuine complexity has been lost beneath the weight of that unequal reckoning. Like any woman who has ever been told she was too much, too ambitious, too calculating, too dangerous to be trusted with the power she nonetheless held, Catherine de Medici knew precisely what it cost to refuse to become smaller than the moment required. She paid that cost for nearly 70 years. And in the end, whatever history chose to call her, she was never, not once, safely ignored again. Perhaps, in the quiet hours long after her death, when historians finally began sifting patiently through the letters she left behind rather than the pamphlets written by her enemies, something of the real woman began to emerge from beneath the legend. Not a sorceress bent over cauldrons in candlelit chambers, but a mother writing anxiously to a son on campaign, urging him to dress warmly and eat properly, worried in the specific, mundane ways every mother across every century has worried about a child far from home. Not a poisoner calculating her next victim, but a queen dictating letters late into the night, negotiating grain shipments to famine-stricken provinces, settling disputes between minor nobles too petty for her sons to bother with, doing the unglamorous, exhausting work of governance that history rarely remembers because it produces no dramatic story. Only the quiet, unremarked stability of a kingdom that somehow, against extraordinary odds, held together for 30 years under her steady, careful hand. Her cultural legacy, too, stretches far beyond the political intrigue for which she is most remembered. She is widely credited, whether or not every detail of the popular account survives close historical scrutiny, with helping introduce elements of Italian Renaissance cuisine, ballet, and courtly entertainment into French culture. Traditions that would flower, in the centuries following her death, into some of the very art forms France would eventually become famous for producing. The elaborate court spectacles she funded and organized throughout her regency, blending music, dance, and theatrical allegory, are considered by many historians to be a direct ancestor of French ballet, as it would later develop. It is a strange, layered inheritance for a woman remembered so overwhelmingly for darkness, that some of what she left behind was, in fact, extraordinary beauty. And perhaps that duality is the truest legacy of all. Not a poisoner, not simply a monster, but a woman who across nearly 7 decades of siege, humiliation, motherhood, war, and grief, refused every single opportunity the world offered her to disappear quietly into the footnotes of men's histories. She built something instead, flawed, blood-soaked in places, undeniably real, a kingdom held together, however imperfectly, by a woman history never expected to hold anything at all. And so we come to the end of Catherine de Medici's story. A life that began in an orphaned infant hidden behind convent walls, and ended with a queen mother who had outmaneuvered kings, survived massacres of her own making, and held together a fracturing kingdom through sheer force of will for nearly 30 years. Perhaps she was the monster her enemies painted her to be. Perhaps she was simply a woman who understood, better than almost anyone in her era, exactly what survival demanded of those the world had already decided to underestimate. History has rarely made room for both truths to exist in the same woman. Catherine de Medici insisted on holding both anyway. Think of the girl in the besieged convent, listening to men outside debate her death. Think of the young bride, humiliated for decades in a marriage that offered her no warmth, who turned that humiliation into patience and patience into power. Think of the widow in black, who buried a husband, 3 sons who wore crowns, and most of the children she had fought so hard to bring into the world, and who kept working anyway, kept negotiating anyway, kept trying to hold together a kingdom that seemed determined, again and again, to tear itself apart around her. Whatever judgment history finally settles on her, that endurance alone deserves to be remembered. Thank you for spending this night with me here on She-Wolves Sleep. If her story moved you, a like helps other sleepy souls find us. And tell me, do you think the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre was calculated ruthlessness or a political calculation that spiraled tragically beyond her control? Your thoughts mean everything. Subscribe. We have so many more she-wolves waiting in the shadows. Let the candlelight of 16th century France fade gently from your mind now. Let the weight of crowns and conspiracies drift away. There is nothing left to guard against tonight, only rest. Sleep well, dear soul, and may Catherine's fierce, unbreakable spirit stay gently with you in your dreams. Until next time, good night from She-Wolf Sleep.